you all know, this is not a date that is a reference for anything except for a reference point in the contract. It has no contractual value. All right, this is an offer from, all right, this is the same. However, they do want to clarify that it is perfectly okay to use a shortened version of an entity name. All right, so we do see that sometimes people say, I don't want to put the trust name in there because the trust is too long. There's an area in the back, at the very end of the contract, where you can put the full trust name if it's an entity or an LLC or something that's a long name. So it's perfectly okay to use a abbreviated name there. And also important to note that please don't put assignee. I still see that a lot. People putting assignee in there. The ability to do assignment is already a given in the contract. So you do not need to put assignee if there's any thought of doing that. Right? Of course,
Sorry, good question already.
I know you. I'm sorry.
But buyer, there's only one there. Does it?
You can put multiple names.
In the one.
The two. Yeah, it's supposed to be for two, and then have the additional signature line. Yeah. Right. Property is the same. You'll see it now says parcel numbers. So sometimes there are multiple parcel numbers associated with the transaction. You can now put both of them in there. They give you a little bit longer line to do that. Current RPA doesn't really give you space to do it. It's perfectly fine. They did add this little disclaimer, postal or mailing address may be different. Buyer to investigate. You'll see they actually put a lot of onus on the buyer in this RPA, the buyer to do their due diligence. So that has been added. You'll see in here that we are used to seeing price COE in this first section. That is moved down into the grid. So you'll see that in a moment. Perfect. Thanks. All right. Oh, down just a little. All right. Section 2 is agency disclosure. This really has not changed. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys how important it is to fill this out correctly. Lisa, I'm sure would be over there like smiling, nodding, yes, please. So you need to have the brokerage name, the license number, the agent, and their license number in here properly. If it is not correct, or if it is left blank, an agency confirmation form must be done to correct or to add your agency in here. Okay, so definitely TCs and file reviewers are going to tell you if this is not correct or not completed, it needs to be done. Right? This was actually part of agency law, not just because we like it that way. So the 81 and the 82 are the agency disclosure forms. They will still be included, but we do still need this on the actual RPA document. They did add this line number C. Don't see this very often, but more than one brokerage, not agent, right? More than one brokerage representing a buyer or seller. You check the box, and it's going to automatically add in the ADA form. Okay. Potentially competing buyers and sellers. This is our PRBS. This is still required. It will still attach to the document. All right, that's everything for section 2. Any questions? I will let you guys ask questions, but we do need to kind of keep going along. Well, that's pretty simple. All right, now we get to the grid. You will see let me tell you how the grid works, first of all. This is all part of section 3. The grid is section 3. Then right here is the subsections within the grid. Over here, where it references a paragraph number, that is the paragraph within the body of the contract that it is referencing. All right, so if you have any question about a specific item in here, you're going to look for the detail in the paragraph number. Right? When you're doing a counteroffer to perhaps change purchase price or any of these other terms, the item you are going to reference is the grid item number. So for example, if it is purchase price, it would be 3A. If it is something else, it could be 3E1, 3E2, 2, those are the grid line items that you would reference if you need to do a counteroffer, addendum, etc. Right? Does that make sense and how they laid this out? Okay, so now you'll see purchase price here across the top. They've got a box for all cash. B, close of escrow. This is the same as we have now. One thing I do want to make sure that you guys know, you will see in here there's areas where the word day is in capital letters, and there's areas where they're using date, which is lowercase. Anything in here where they're referencing something with a capital letter, that is the way it is defined within the glossary of the contract. So you will see that capital letter days is the way it's being defined later in the contract. We'll talk about that when we get there. But you just need to remember that days is not calendar days, whereas date, lowercase d, is. There's some other areas where they use those capital letters to signify a specific term. Okay, expiration of offer used to be at the back, now it's right here at the top. Initial deposit. You now see they've got a space for the dollar amount and a space that allows for a percentage calculation. I'm telling you, people are going to get confused by this. The percentage calculation is not contractual. So you have a $500,000 house and you put $15,000 here to be the 3% down payment or initial deposit, and then the purchase price changes. The dollar amount doesn't change to be the same percentage. It says right on here, the percentage number is for calculation purposes. It is not a contractual term. So you'll see that multiple places in this grid. They think that they are doing this to be provide a courtesy so that you can see percentages, but it is not contractual. Make sense?
So it doesn't change the purchase price?
Right.
It's
the dollar amount. And earnest money deposit is not the best one to be an example because earnest money deposit has always been a solid amount. But you'll see those other places here like loan amount where you may put in an 80% loan that is not automatically change contractually. You're not saying we're committing to an 80% loan. You're saying we're committing to the loan dollar amount that we placed in the contract. Where that gets more interesting is like you'll see in here places for seller closing cost credits. Right? It's not a percentage. It has to be a dollar amount.
So does the percentage have to be filled out? Is that a mandatory?
Zip Forms is supposed to fill it out for you.
Okay.
So if in fact the deposit amount, if we increase the deposit amount, that we change and,
You have to put it in a counteroffer.
right,
Yeah.
but according to the grid, the dollar amount, not the 3%.
Not the percentage.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
So if you put in the dollar amount, it will calculate the percentage.
Percentage.
And if you put in the percentage, it will calculate the dollar amount.
My understanding, you have to put in the dollar amount. I have not seen the new editor. So this is all part of the new editor. My understanding, you put in the dollar amount, it's automatically going to pop in the percentage.
Should work the reverse. That's like silly.
Well, we'll see. Yeah. I think it will not work the reverse because it's not supposed to be the contractual.
Right, but it just for ease of figuring out what the number is.
The grid.
But you will see that this is going to cause, I think, some people some confusion, particularly when it comes to seller closing cost credit. All right, increased deposit. In the event you have an increased deposit, we don't see that very often. But if you did, they have a new form called the DID that is delivery of increased deposit. It is a replacement of the RID, which is the receipt for increased deposit. So it's a new form, but it's basically the same thing. Rarely see increased deposits being used, but in the event that you do, happy to talk through that with you guys. Okay, loan amount is E1. Right, you've got a spot here for your first loan. It defaults to conventional. You've got boxes here with FHA or VA. Interest rate, fixed interest rate that you can put in here to exceed. Now remember we currently have the line that will allow you to put in points, right? It defaults to 0 points. or you can add in a number, but it defaults to 0 points. Right here, this one throws off a lot of people. You see this 17 days after acceptance. This is not your loan contingency date. This relates to this clause right here. If FHA or VA are checked, deliver a list of lender-required repairs. That is due within 17 days. Those lender-required repairs, that 17 days is the same date that we have now. But the way they put it here on the grid confuses people a little bit. But you've got to kind of read this thing across when you're working on it. They are taking away the what was it, the FHBA, I think? No, the FBA. The FBA is currently the form that you use for a buyer to submit lender-required repairs to the seller. That form is going away. That information is going to be incorporated into the repair request, which kind of makes sense. So all your requests are in the same document, and you're not sitting there with two different repair request documents. Right? If you check FHA or VA, it will automatically attach the FBA, which is the FBAS, which is the amendatory clause, and it will automatically attach the HID, which is the get a home inspection document. Those two are required on FHA or VA transactions. Okay. Additional financing looks basically exactly the same. So same thing with our percentage and so forth. And then down here in E3, occupancy type defaults to primary. That's what we've got now. But now you have two different options if it's not primary. You've got a secondary home or an investment. So those are two options that those are options we can have now. And then balance of down payment, that should auto-calculate just like it does now. And purchase price total will be restated here at the bottom.
So are secondary and investment in law free because they have calculated?
No, I don't think that they are. That is subject, I would say, discuss with the lender if you are needing to make if there's a loan on the property and you need to make that determination. All right, okay, stop here. So we'll continue to have property address and date at the top. So you guys made it through the first page. Pretty good, right? It's not so bad. I can't see any of my notes because it's so dark up here, but hopefully you guys are good. And yeah, they're good. Okay. All right, this will continue to be at the top. Property address and date. Zip forms and SkySlip should automatically fill that out for you. Seller credit. So we didn't have a line item for that before. It's nice to have that in here. So if you're asking for closing cost credit for your buyer, you've got 5,000, 2,000, whatever it is. Again, it's supposed to be a number, not a percentage. And so if you want it to be a percentage, you're going to have to add that in an additional term somewhere. But it is intended to be a number. We'll see if Zip Forms, how that editor looks when we get to it. This does say seller credit will be applied at closing costs or, so typically closing costs is what we ask for. They felt it was not necessary to have the recurring or non-recurring in there. And so they've taken that out of the equation. It's just closing cost credit.
So with the closing costs, once you fully execute the contract and say you have these requests for repairs and that's after it's executed, and would you go back and
You could have an amendment.
you wouldn't adjust it?
No, not in here, because this is already executed document.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this would be if you're going in requesting closing cost credit. You don't see that too much in this market, but eventually the market will switch, settle down a bit, and we will see closing cost credits again at some point in time being requested at purchase agreement. All right, additional financing terms. So if there's something else that you need to put in here in regards to financing, that's where this will go. Verification of all cash, verification of down payment, verification of loan application. These have all changed Default is attached. We've spent the last few years having to remember to check the box. The default now is that you will attach them with the contract, which, as we've been telling you for years now, that you needed to do that anyway. So that's the default, and then if you want it to be different, you can change the, add some days. But you all are writing your contracts with all of those things in hand anyway. I know that you are. All right. Down in here is your, again, in the loan application, you'll see that there's now 3 different categories. So it's not just pre-approval, pre-qualification is approved, is attached. It's the pre-qualification, pre-approval, fully underwritten pre-approval. So you will be selecting from those 3 options on what type of letter you are attaching. This is where you again need to have a conversation with your lender and know what you've got.
Those blank boxes, are those you to type in something that you want to type in on the right?
This?
Yeah.
No. The gray is grayed out. You will not be able to type anything in there. I will tell you, these lines here, all these lines, they're pretty small for you to type in anything. Anything that goes over will go into the overflow text addendum. It does that now. If you have something that goes beyond the line spacing, it will automatically create an overflow text addendum. We may see more of those coming across now because there are these lines are pretty small. So there's not a lot of room to write in these. But no, they don't give you a big box, like a text box to just put whatever you want. No. Wishful thinking. All right, any questions here? Good? Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, on a trust property that requires court confirmation, the close of escrow date. There doesn't seem to be any room to say. And then if there doesn't seem to be a place regarding finance that there is no loan contingency.
Well, you would do, can you scroll back up?
Oh, I see. Okay, it says no loan contingency. Okay.
All cash.
Yeah, I see
So
it.
when you check the all cash,
Got
that
it.
takes away the loan.
No, and there's a box that says no loan contingency.
Yeah.
L1.
L1.
Well, then yes, if you're getting a loan, but you're going in with no loan contingency, you would use that. If you're going in with all cash,
Right, then
that
you use
automatically
yes.
takes away the loan
Yeah.
contingency. Yeah. I has been left intentionally blank because they felt like it would be confusing. It looks too much like a 1.
She does make a good point though about close of escrow with the confirmation.
You're probably going to have to put that into your other terms. There's a spot at the very end for each terms. Final verification of condition, 5 days. That's the same as now, 5 days prior to signing. Assignment request. We will be talking about assignment a little bit later, but assignment request now 17 days after acceptance. Right now, it's open-ended. You can do it at any point in time. We had one just recently where they did an assignment, but like less than a week before closing. So now it is within the first 17 days. Assignment being if their buyer is in contract and now they want to basically assign their interest in this transaction to somebody else. Where we see it a lot is an investor will write this in their personal name and then they want to assign it over to an LLC or corporation.
Does this include one spouse is buying and then at the last second they want to add the other spouse?
No.
It's only for investors?
Well, yeah, assigning to a non-wholly owned entity. So we will talk about assignment a little bit more later. Contingencies. You will see the same date is now all the way up and down this grid. Pretty much every contingency is moved to 17 days. All right, starting with loan. All right, everybody, what is the current loan contingency date?
21 days, yeah.
Yeah, so that is getting shortened to 17. Do you have a question? No, you just knew the answer.
have a comment.
You have a comment?
I'll wait.
Okay. All right, so 17 days for your loan contingency. Make sure you are having good conversation with your lender that you can accommodate that, or you're going to need to bump that time out. You do, of course, have the chance to put that in your little parentheses and have a longer time frame. Appraisal contingency based on appraised value at a minimum purchase price, or, so you've got a spot here where if you want to allow the appraised value to be a little bit lower, and you're still willing to purchase at a lower appraised value, but you've got this space in here to do that. So maybe the property is listed at 800, you decide to write an offer at 900, and you're willing to take it as long as the appraised value reaches 850, something like that. Right? That's what this is for. We've seen a lot of creative language around appraisals over the last couple of years now. So they've given us this spot here to be able to be a little more flexible in those appraised values. And it's also 17 days. You've got this spot here where you can remove the appraisal contingency. All right, do note, removing appraisal contingency on FHA or VA does not actually remove the appraisal contingency, because they do have to sign the FPAC, which is the amendatory clause. The amendatory clause is a standalone document that maintains the appraisal contingency for FHA or VA loans. All right, so putting that, once you are into the amendatory clause, there is no waiving appraisal for FHA and VA. Okay. Okay. Investigation of property, that's 17 days. That's the same. Informational access to the property. This is in here now, but a lot of people don't see it, don't use it. This is what allows the buyer to go into the property even if their contingencies have been waived. So think of it this way: how often is it that you've got a buyer who wants to get back into the property to measure for carpet, to show the mother-in-law, whatever reason it is that they want to get back into the property? That is currently set at 17 days. However, you know that your clients are going to want to get in there throughout the transaction. You may want to expand that out. You know, Carolyn always does that to allow for clients to come in and out. Otherwise, seller does not have to let you come back in, right? So sometimes you've got sellers that are concerned if you have, now you've released your contingencies or you've already done your inspections and now you want to come in later and you're measuring for flooring, and then you bring in the contractor and it turns out that it's going to cost you 10 times more than you thought to do that kitchen remodel you wanted, and now you're looking for a way out. And so sellers frequently, once you've kind of gotten through those initial home inspections, they don't want to let you back in. So if you're representing the buyer, you may want to give them the opportunity to come back in. This has been kind of hidden in the RPA. Now it's going to be a little more visible. So if you're representing the listing, you may need to be aware. Review of seller documents. This is all the seller disclosures. 17 days, again, after acceptance, or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. So you guys, it's so very important to get those disclosure documents, everything that the seller needs to provide to the buyer in a timely manner, because if you don't, you could be extending and keeping that window of contingency time open, which would not be a good thing for your seller, right? So you need to maintain that fiduciary relationship and get everything done in a timely manner. Same thing, title report, 17 days, 5 days after receipt. Common interest, that's your HOA, your CC&Rs, same thing, 17 days. These are all the same as they are now. Review lease and lien, so if it's got solar panels or something along those lines, same thing. These dates are the same as they are now. Just be aware of them, right? So right here, you'll see in this column over here, the only two contingencies that can be released within the RPA is the loan and the appraisal. If you are going to release all contingencies, I've seen that recently, if you're going to release other contingencies, it has to be on a contingency release form that will be attached. So if you want to go in with something else besides loan or appraisal release, you will need to actually check this box. It will attach the contingency release form and you will select what you want from there.
On our transactions where there aren't any contingencies, and this seems to exempt FHA and VA appraisal, do we need to treat that in the same way under other terms?
You know, if they have signed the amendatory clause, then that appraisal, that contingency remains in place. I'm sorry, what was the?
The question is, we don't allow any appraisal contingencies. We don't care what kind of financing it is. So do we need to then treat that in the other terms?
That's a very interesting question because you're working off of a court prior no contingencies, but FHA amendatory clause, and maybe I'll ask Doug if he has any comments or could maybe circle back with this later, but a mandatory clause is a standalone document that absolutely keeps the appraisal contingency in play if it's an FHA or VA loan.
So that's going to preclude our
But
court
that's
cases
occurring now.
from accepting FHA and VA deals.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's actually in play now.
Yeah, it's no
That's a
change
law.
for
It
now.
is in play,
Yeah.
it's a law. So if it had come up, they would win.
Yeah,
In that instance, the court would have to back down.
yeah. Okay.
We're not taking-
Moving
we're not
on.
going to take any FHA or VA.
All right, let's talk
Nothing's
about contingency releases. Remember, anything besides loan or appraisal has to be on a CR form. Sale of buyer's property, right? You check this one, that's going to attach the COP. That looks very similar, that looks the same as what we've got now. Okay. Possession, time of possession. This is new. This is new. Upon notice of recordation. So right now, it says that occupancy, time of possession is 6 p.m. on the date of close of escrow or checkbox, blah, blah, blah. Right, that's what it says now. New, it's at the time it records. Yay, at the time it records.
Can you say that again?
Possession, occupancy is at the time it records. So right now, it defaults to being 6 p.m. and it's got the checkbox where you can change the time. That goes away. You do have the choice to make it a specific time. Otherwise, it is at the time it records. Okay, so make sure that your sellers understand that if we get confirmation of recording at 10 a.m., they gotta be out.
Wow, okay.
Right? They do not have until 6 p.m. anymore. No more ordering pizza and spending the afternoon finished treat it now. They gotta go. Okay, seller occupied or vacant units. Okay. COE date. Okay, this is, are they staying in possession, right? Is the seller staying in possession? Now they make it, this is the same as it is now, but they're making it a little clearer. You need to select if they're staying for 29 days or fewer, 30 days or more. You're going to have the SIP or the RLAS that automatically attach. This is the same as now, but it's nice to see it in the grid.
So, question on that. Does 7C indicate a time, or do you need to then check a time box?
Time box is going to be on the SIP or the RLAS.
Okay.
And as far as days, and we'll talk about days in the glossary, but days for this, the date that it records is day 0. So if it recorded today at noon, right, this is still day 0. They're staying for 3 days. Day 1 is tomorrow. Day 2 is Friday. Then get occupancy on Saturday. Okay. Good. Tenant occupied units. Here's where we have a new form. You guys need this good. Stacy's excited about all these new forms. All right. Tenant occupied units. New form. The TOPA. Right? Who likes that? What is it? Topa beer? Yeah, try and remember that. All right. Tenant occupied property every addenda. This goes on every transaction that is tenant occupied at the time of acceptance, whether they are leaving or not. Whether they are leaving or not. If it is tenant occupied and they're moving out next week, but you have acceptance today, you still have to have the TOPA form now. Okay? If it is tenant occupied at the time of acceptance. Right? PCs, follower viewers, are going to have to really be on you guys because don't forget to do that. Right? And just so you know, the default on that form is that the tenant remains in possession. I know. I know. Yes. So, I didn't write it. Didn't write it. All right. Documents, fees. All right. Seller shall deliver documents within 7 days. Oh, sorry, question.
I'm sorry, but on the tenant, the TOPA form, it defines tenant in the form as meaning any adult person other than the seller occupying the property. So if you've got two people cohabiting and title is only in one name, you have to treat their partner as a tenant?
No?
Okay.
Even if they're not.
That's awkward.
Okay, wait, I'm not. I don't know about that, because tenant would have to be paying and have a lease, so we gotta be careful.
Any occupant
Any occupant
that is
does.
not on title. Right? Seller can move. Yeah, Granny's so smart, she's catching all these little things. Title is the seller. Seller moves out. Maybe it's a breakup situation. The partner that was never on title decides to stay. You got the buyer, you got a problem.
I call it CARs, we will have to come on this.
Still.
They're considered.
To make sure they're all
Yeah.
Just to,
It's
when you
exactly.
get to page 5, it's on time, page 11, so they're out of order, so just FYI. If you have all the pages, it's
Just
just
each one
the
has the
5
same.
to 11,
Not just the
or
same.
4 to 11 are that time, so.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was trying to reference something, I'm like, I don't have page 5, and when I find page 5 gone, that is.
So adult children are considered the same.
yes. Some people would like to move out and leave their adult children there. All right, delivery of documents, 7 days, that is the same as now. Sign and return escrow holder provisions, 5 days, that is the same as now. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA docs, 3 days, same as now, okay? Install smoke alarm CO detectors and water heater braces. Yay!
That's great for appraisal. Yeah,
Yes,
that's really
finally
good.
in here with 8 days, 7 days after acceptance. If you're trying to get your appraiser out there faster, you might want to shorten that time frame. But default is 7 days,
It doesn't say who.
right? And 5, evidence of representative authority, 3 days after acceptance. That is the same as now, but what you are used to hearing is our representative capacity signature disclosure. That form is actually not going to be used much anymore. We'll talk about that later, but that's what they're talking about. Evidence of representative authority, ability to sign if it's a trust, LLC, corporation, etc. Okay? Whew, page 2, hang in there, good job. Oh, you guys are going to love this one. Items included, top of page 3. Items included, what do we have now? 3 things. What are they? Stove, washer, dryer, refrigerator. You'll see we've got a few more they have added now. So we've still got stove, refrigerator. Now we have wine refrigerator. You want to check that, ask for your email too. Washer, dryer, refrigerator, microwave, video doorbells, security cameras, security systems, smart home devices, all of that is now in this reference in here. wall mounted brackets. That is a change from our current contract. It gets into more detail later, but just so you know, right now is what? The brackets stay, the TV goes, right? That's the default. TV goes, brackets stay, unless you check the box. Now, brackets go unless you check for them to stay. So, conversation with your sellers. Above ground pool. Bathroom mirrors are the only one that come automatically checked. So apparently that is super important to have the bathroom mirrors. But it comes automatically checked. Electric charging stations. How many listings have those Tesla charging stations in there? Yep.
We don't know, let's get to the body of it.
And potted plants. So you've got some room here to add other things. We will see later, there's more definition to this paragraph. But please be mindful of it. I anticipate agents that will be lazy and just check every single box, whether the property has it or not. Right? So if you are representing the seller and you get this, pay attention to what is and isn't checked in here.
In the follow-up with the wall-mounted brackets, if you didn't check that, does it then specify that they have to be
Removed, holes patched, not painted. So it's the exact same what we've got now.
If there's a refrigerator or a freezer in the garage, an extra one, does that have to be listed extra?
Refrigerators, so the checkbox would imply all refrigerators. So if you are checking that, they see that.
I would argue though that doesn't include freezers.
Check them before.
The freezer is a separate entity. This is referencing refrigerators. Yeah. You've got excluded items here. Apparently, you can only exclude 3 things. That's all.
So if you want to leave the brackets behind, you
here.
have to check
Who
all
pays
of
for the
them.
smoke alarm?
Yeah.
So you don't have to patch them.
Right. So if you've got the listing and they don't want to patch it, that's the same. They don't want to patch, then you have to counter. So you're going to leave them. Yep. But also remember, right, the patch not painted, make sure your buyers are aware of that, because when they walk in the first time, quite frankly, most buyers would much rather see those brackets than big spaces on the wall with white, bad patching jobs that has not been painted. So make sure that your buyers are aware of what they're agreeing to in the contract. Okay, Q, allocation of costs. All right, natural hazard disclosure report. And you can put in here, oh, by the way, right up here, sorry, allocation of costs. Who pays? This only applies to this particular section of the column. If it's a buyer or seller, you can select that. If it's both, it's going to be evenly split, unless it's down here on where they have the option on escrow for it to be each their own. So buyer, seller, both is going to be 50-50, or there's the each their own box for escrow. All right, we'll get to that. But that is the escrow back here. Yep. Here, Q2, Q3, these do not apply to the NHD. These are areas where you can put other reports. So if you wanted, don't see it too often now, if you still wanted to have seller to provide the termite report, right, that would be in here. Again, reports, not work done. Reports. Right here, again, is prepared by, very small line, depending on which NHD provider you prefer. If it's, maybe First American, you might have to abbreviate something like that. Otherwise, it's going into that text overflow.
I'm sure, is the printing like so tiny?
It's the same size. It's going to be the same size as what we've got now. But right now, the line to put in the provider for NHD is pretty long. So, yeah.
And even like the
So make friends with the rep with the short name.
But really that's going to be based on the math of zip forms or so that might be a much longer line. That's
true, but there's not a lot of room. I mean, the Sky Slope and zip forms are both just imaging out what is provided by
they do
CAR.
a really tiny font. I mean,
They
so
could,
we have to wait and
but
see.
they usually don't. have not seen them do a small quantity.
The issue is they want us to all to be in this grid now, and then by putting it to an additional piece of paper, it completely bypasses what they're trying to do by having it all on the grid. Doesn't make sense.
Just need a little more space. They got plenty of room. Look, they got this thing spaced out underneath. All right, smoke alarms, water, carbon monoxide water heater bracing. You just saw where it said that has to be done, default is 7 days. This is who is going to be responsible for paying for that to be done. So generally we ask seller to do it, but that's negotiable there. Government required point of sale inspections and reports. Again, not the work to be done, just the report. If you are doing something, transaction in an area that is going to need a government required inspection, then you need to address that here. Then the second line, Q6, this one says who's going to pay for it. Right, so who's going to pay for the report versus who's going to pay for the remedial action, any corrective action. So those are two separate, quite frankly, it is actually already like that in our RPA, but a lot of people get confused. I think it's a little clearer being lined out this way. Escrow fees, again, you've got the each their own or the both, so be careful which one you're checking. Escrow holder, got a little more room there to put a good name. Hopefully InterValley will fit in there. Owner's title insurance policy, it's the same as we've got now. Escrow title company, we've got a line for that. Buyer's lender title is default to buyer, so they're at least acknowledging that now. And it will be, unless otherwise directed by the buyer, it'll be the same title company. Okay, you've got county taxes, city taxes, HOA, all our HOA stuff. All of this is the same as what you've got now, just lined out a little bit differently. Okay? Q13, yes. And that is the case now. So HOA certification fee has to be paid by the buyer. The preparation of the document disclosures is done by the seller, but the HOA transfer fees is negotiable. Private transfer fees, see it occasionally. That's in here now. Buyer, seller, or both. Better find out if you have a listing that has a private transfer fee, you need to know that. Other costs or fees, so we've got space here for other things. And then home warranty plan. Now expires until both. Buyer can waive a home warranty. Cost not to exceed issued by. You will see we don't have all the check boxes for pool and air conditioner and upgrades and all of that stuff. They've scrapped all that. This is an allowance. You get to use it how you want to. Yay.
What do you put in that field by the home warranty plan? What are all those lines for?
I have no idea.
Good question.
No idea. But the subsequent paragraph language acknowledges that it is now an allowance, which it is not currently. It is an allowance buyer to select coverage. Other terms?
So for sure the buyer gets to select them.
Yeah, it's in here later.
Okay.
All right, other terms. Yeah.
I was just gonna say possibly the extra line would be to write in what you wanted covered, because oftentimes who's ordering our warranty protection
Could
plans,
be
right?
for escrow if they were gonna try and select, they wanted to put it in there, but
Kelly, are you saying like for pool and?
Well, like, yeah, everybody has already designate what it's going to cover, so then when it comes to order, there's one less communication, right? We're getting, hey, here's the TC or escrow, hey, we have it in there, I can use it.
could be,
Are
but
they gonna still have drop down that you can pick?
no. I don't believe so. But do know, there's the home warranty plans now have so many different options that are outside of those few check boxes that are on our current RPA. It's really best, if you're representing the buyer, to have that you order the coverage that's going to be appropriate for this property. And don't just have escrow do it. You need to do it. Other terms. Okay, that's the end of the grid. Yay! There is no longer independent a purchase agreement for probate or manufactured home. Right now, those are independent purchase, standalone purchase agreements. Those are going away.
Now, like moving
You
forward
will
with
use
this,
this purchase
nothing
agreement, and you will
everything
add
you have
a
checked is ready to
probated
go.
agreement versus addendum, if it's probate, or the manufactured home purchase agreement addendum. So those are new, and they will each need to be attached to this RPA. Does that make sense? Yeah, and it is actually going to make it a little easier. We've got, of course, in our property addenda, the tenant occupied, again, right here, should be checked whether current tenants are remaining or not. Okay, and then, yeah.
It seems to me that if that tenant occupied, if I totally agree with what Randy said, the RLA does not address this at all and asking the owner, the people who live in the property.
In the listing agreement?
Yes.
I've not seen a update to the listing agreement to reference this. So I don't know if they are making a change to the RLA. They have not released the full list of what the changes are on all the other documents.
Because that's, unless we link that back, we're asking the seller to sign something that they may not have any control over at all. You know, so we have to really get that right.
Again, they were supposed to have, they were supposed to have the red line versions out in October. They are not out yet. They were going to do all of this in 2020. You'd think they would have had plenty of time to get this together. But it's all right, you guys. We got it. It's going to be fine. Tenancy in common or stock cooperative. Rarely see that here. So if you happen to come across a transaction like that, we can talk about that online. Those addenda are available. Other addenda. Okay, so an addendum, right? Standard addendum that we have now. Got all those blank lines. You can put what you need to in there. Short sale addendum is the same. Backup offer addendum is available in here. Septic and well, that's the same as we have now. Buyer's intent to exchange addendum and seller's intent to exchange addendum. These are new documents for 1031 exchange if it's the buyer or the seller that are doing the exchange. Right? So include those. You've got room for other. Again, not a lot of space, but other is where you're going to put the deal-back addenda, right? To include that as part of the purchase agreement. Any addenda that is not referenced in the purchase agreement and agreed to by both parties, there's no obligation for them to sign. So if you're doing that, you would add, that's where you would add a brokerage addenda. Also would be, right, well, most of those are advisories. Yeah, so down here is in advisories. Advisories are provided as reference purposes. So addenda will be automatically included into the RPA, whereas advisories, if you check the box, will not. Okay, yes?
The deal-back addendum that's to the SBSA, we put that under,
It would be,
addendum or under advisory?
well, Mona likes it under addendum, because technically it's addenda. I mean, technically, it's an addendum to the SBSA. So really, you could put it as an addendum on the SBSA document and never actually reference it in the RPA. However, at that point, you would have no no recourse in having people sign. So the buyer and seller price. So in regards to that, the SBSA, guess what? The SBSA got an update. Good news is it's not going to check and automatically be part of the purchase agreement. But let me remind myself, it has been revised to include 63 topic paragraphs and an introduction page. So if you have any clients with insomnia, you can feel free to send that over to them and give them a little assistance with that. 63 paragraphs. Tell me who is going to read all that. They don't read their purchase agreement, they're sure not going to read the SBSA. But we include it anyway. So SBSA, this comes automatically checked, this advisory section with the BIA. That is what we have now. The wire fraud, same as now. Fair housing is automatically attached, and the the California Consumer Privacy Act, automatically checked. All four of those will come over with the purchase agreement. Now, of course, the box for the statewide buyer and seller. Short sale and probate both have their own advisories that you would need to check and include. Wildfire disaster, I want to talk to you guys about this. This is the wildfire disaster advisory. Guess what? This is not the fire hardening defensible space document. Fire hardening defensible space is actually one of the statutory disclosures. It is not considered an advisory. This right here, this wildfire disaster advisory, this is just an optional advisory that is recommended, right? Not the required document. Why they didn't put the required one as a checkbox, I don't know. But
It's not really advisory.
because it's a statutory disclosure, right? So that's why it's not in there, but there will be people who check that box thinking that they have met that requirement. It is not the document that meets that statutory requirement, right? It's just another advisory. We've got the trust advisory, the REO advisory, same as we have now. You've got this section for others. This is where you're going to add the market conditions advisory. This is where you would put in the square footage and lot size. We're going to put that one actually up here because that's not technically an addendum, square footage and lot size. So the other documents that we frequently attach, that Mona would like for us to attach, those will need to be included in here. Affiliated business is, we should do that up here. Yeah.
That has to go there.
So a lot of things to attach onto it. But this is the one I think is going to really confuse people.
Yeah.
It is not satisfied the statutory disclosure requirement, okay? Additional terms affecting purchase price. All right, deposit. Initial deposit, they shall deliver the deposit within 3 days. That is the same. However, the default is for it to be a wire transfer. Right now it says electronic transfer, which is really wire transfer, but nobody, they think that maybe that means some other electronic option. So they are changing the language to be wire transfer. If you check a box and change the method of how it's being delivered, and Escrow doesn't like that, I know somebody who likes to change the box. If Escrow doesn't like that, they have the right to say, nope, it has to be wire. So buyer can select a different method, but Escrow can overrule. Okay? A1, that second sentence. If a method other than wire transfer is specified in the grid, and such a method is unacceptable to escrow holder, then upon notice from escrow holder, deliver shall be by wire transfer. So just get in the habit of telling your buyers that it's going to have to be wire transfer. Don't give them an option.
In the age of crypto, that's crazy.
I didn't write it.
That's so bad.
We got some dinosaurs on the Forms Committee.
They did. Here we are. We're going to make it work. All right. Just prepare your clients, because now that escrow has the authority to say no to something else, they probably will. Right? You can find out if Inter Valley is okay with it or not, but just be prepared. All right, increased deposit is the same thing. It's following the same rules. So if they make you change for your initial deposit, increased deposit follows suit. Again, we've got that the DID form if you're using an increased deposit. Rarely see that being utilized. Retention of deposit. All right, see this a lot, right? Non-refundable, blah, 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 blah. Right? This paragraph right here is saying, do not write down anything like that. Let me just paraphrase this for you. That anything trying to change the language, buyer or seller, trying to change the language regarding release of deposit may violate the statutory rules. They recommend that the language comes from the attorney, because if it does not meet the statutory requirements, that clause will be invalid anyway. So if you've got somebody that really insists that they want something written in there about non-refundable deposit, they have to get an attorney to write it for them, or it may be invalid, and here is where you can explain that to them. Okay? Okay, all cash
Except the
offer,
language.
no loan is needed, purchase of property, it is then not contingent on a loan, and it's really the same as now. First loan will be conventional unless otherwise specified. Here's a good one, section 3, this is new. Buyer's loan status, this is an interesting one for our lenders in the room. All right, buyer authorizes seller, C3, this page. Buyer authorizes seller and seller's authorized agent, right, to contact buyer's lender to determine the status of any buyer's loan specified in 3E. Any alternate loan buyer pursues, whether or not a contingency of this agreement. If the contact information is different than what is provided in the pre-approval letter, that's what it's referencing, then it shall be delivered updated contact information within 1 day of request. So now, not only does the agent have the authority to contact the lender, the seller can call them too. Right? Yes, so the seller can call and talk to the buyer's lender. Be aware. All right, just a reminder on that amendatory clause, they've got that in here multiple times about the amendatory clause does not allow you to waive free. Okay, does say in the very last sentence of section 4 right here, seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any lender requirements unless agreed to in writing, right? So sometimes you'll hear people say, I don't want to take an FHA loan or a VA loan because I'm gonna have to pay for these repairs, right? They do not have to. That is not new, but I wanted to make sure that you know where to reference that within the contract.
Okay, got it.
Balance purchase price, deposited to escrow holder. Limits on credits to buyer, again, not new, but further clarified. If you have negotiated a closing cost credit, maybe you've negotiated a $10,000 closing cost credit, that information has to be disclosed to the lender. But the lender is going to have limitations on the amount of credits that will be allowed. So if the amount you have negotiated, let's say you're $10,000, but the lender says, nope, not going to take, you can't have more than $8,000, right? Then it automatically gets adjusted to the $8,000. That doesn't mean you now get this $2,000 in some other capacity, right? So if you have a credit that exceeds the amount that the lender will allow, then you would need to come up with some other way of managing that difference. Maybe you take the difference in a price reduction or something like that, but it will have to be in writing. All right, you'll have to negotiate that outside. Otherwise, the lender, then escrow, are only going to give you the amount of credit that will be allowed. Seller stated financing. Seller is relying on buyer representation that comes with financing specified. Right, we've had this before. This isn't new, but it is again clarified. However, seller has agreed to a specific closing date, purchase price, and sell to the buyer in reliance on buyer's financing. Buyer shall pursue the financing as specified in the agreement, even if buyer elects to pursue alternative forms of financing. Seller has no obligation to cooperate with their efforts, but shall not interfere with closing at the purchase price on the COE date, even if based on alternate financing. Okay, this has come up a lot. People are writing offers for all cash. They get in a transaction and they decide they want a loan. And how many of you have walked into my office and said, we want to cancel? Nope, sorry. As long as the buyer is continuing to perform,
Who cares?
the type of financing is not a contingency. Right, you cannot force them, you don't have to cooperate, so what does that mean? Maybe you don't want to allow their appraiser to come in, but you cannot hinder, you cannot stop them from pursuing an alternate method. This is where it's so important to go ahead and vet them out really well before you accept it. If they're saying they're all cash, double check that they provided the liquid funds to close, right? Not some retirement account that they're never going to be able to get the money out of. but they provided the ability because they are still obligated to purchase the price and close escrow as specified. So they're obligated to continue to perform, but they can explore other financing options. I mean, nobody loves this one, but it is what it is. Okay? So, yes. If you are going to counter it out, you would. And I've had multiple conversations with Mona about this, and she recommends that the seller would need to have an attorney write that language because she's not going to write it, I'm not going to write it, and she doesn't want you to write it either. So if somebody has an attorney that writes one,
I didn't say it.
all right.
So when they come to us the day before closing and say, we're getting a loan, but we couldn't get the loan, now they have to
Now
perform
they
with
do
their all
have
cash
to perform with
purchase.
their all cash purchase. And then you can issue, if they're not performing per the agreement, the timeframes, the contingency removals, right? This doesn't, if they're coming in particularly as all cash, right? They have no loan contingency. They need to continue to perform within what they've agreed to. You start issuing your notice to perform, your demand to close. You've got those options for recourse, but you can't just flat out cancel them because you know they are now pursuing a loan. And quite frankly, we did see a lot of that this year, and most of the time they closed. Yeah. They did, but this is something that sellers don't like. They don't like it.
So is that only, and maybe it's in there, but did that only apply to conventional loans? They can do it on FHA or VA?
Yep. What Carolyn had one recently where they wrote it for conventional and then decided to do FHA. Right?
Well, and in that instance, interesting. So the question was, they would have to sign the mandatory clause. So could that,
But that would require a seller's cooperation. They don't have to cooperate. So a
Right,
seller could say, yeah, if you want to do that, but I'm not signing the mandatory clause. Right? And it is a standalone document, so it would require both signatures. Yeah.
Sellers are obligated to, like an independent person, buyers to perform, there's a rule of
Right, I mean, everyone's
cooperation.
acting in good faith and time is of the essence and all of that is baked in here, but they don't have to, again, they wouldn't have to sign an inventory clause, they wouldn't have to cooperate with an appraisal if it was written without an appraisal contingency. So there's areas where you could, have the seller choose not to be, participate in that. But generally, they need to be allow the buyer to do what they need to do. As long as the buyer is performing, right? Because really at the end of the day, the buyer has agreed to buy the house for this price on this date. And that's really all we care about. They've bought the house for this price on this date. However, that money ends up in the account, as long as it ends up there on time.
It is critical that you guys let us know when the game is afoot. Recently, this month, 2 deals of mine, not Dillbeck guys, but 2. The buyer called me 2 days after the offer was accepted saying, "We're so excited." I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, we have a contract." I said, "You might want to talk to your realtors. I don't know anything about this." So on a 10-day contingency for loan removal, 2 days had already been burnt up. 20% of my runway was already gone before I even got the file going. So please, just like, hike in football, right? We're making an offer. We're in backup, or we're now countering. We think we're gonna get it. This is the address. Let us know ahead of time, so the minute you guys get that contract accepted, we can get flying, because we have a very short runway, and that's how we're getting offers accepted. We're running 10, 11, 12-day contingencies, not 17. I can get closed in 17 days often. So if you want more offers accepted, you gotta accelerate the timeline, but you gotta get in the game early to make sure that my team is moving as quickly as possible. That's all I got. And, yes, ma'am.
Which, to add to that, that would help us contacting you if you, to say, can we check fully underwritten approval when we're submitting our offer?
Right, yeah, I'm happy to do that. And by the way, the last time I was in this room was January 5th, 1980, for my bar mitzvah.
Actually, 81 from prom.
Very nice. And with that, I will give it back to your master of ceremonies, and we are going to be back. So good seeing you all. Have a great day.
All righty.
My dear. See you soon.
Thank you for the gift card.
Sure.
All right, we're good here, better with this? You good? You know, I walk with my hands and everything, so I try and make it work. All right, we are on page 5. We have moved on to section 7, closing and occupancy. Default is the buyer intends to occupy the property. There's a spot on the grid. It is not. Condition of property at close. So this is the same. Hi. All right, condition of property at closing. So it is as is condition, right? You always get those buyers who think that the seller should be required to make any improvements. That is not the case. In California, purchase contract is as is, that is nothing new. And the property should be maintained in its current condition at the time of the acceptance, including the pool, the spa, the landscaping, right? They can't decide to get cheap and cancel the gardener. They have to maintain it. They have to keep watering the lawn, all of those things. Here is a new thing though. Any debris and personal property not included in the sale at the close of escrow or time of possession of the buyer will now become the possession of the buyer and be considered abandoned. All right, so there's always been this discussion about those things that get left behind. So if a seller leaves something behind, it is considered abandoned. If the items are not removed from possession, delivered, deemed abandoned, buyer, after first delivering to seller written notice to remove the items within 3 days, may pay to have such items removed and disposed of and bring legal action as per this agreement to receive reasonable costs from the seller. Okay, so if you've got a seller that's leaving a bunch of trash, you can show them that the buyer has some recourse to go after them. As you will see, it says written notice. You guys know there's this sample forms library in the zip forms, so SkySlope, there's the CAR sample forms. They have a new sample form that you can utilize, sample letter that you can utilize for this and give to the seller to distribute over to the, give to the buyer to send to the seller. So hopefully that all makes sense, but the long and the short of it is, if they leave stuff, it is considered abandoned. All right? Section, paragraph 2 there, where it's in bold letters, is basically a buyer beware paragraph, that their buyer is strongly advised to conduct their investigations of the entire property to determine its condition. Agents may not be aware of all defects, blah, blah, blah. So that's just another spot where they're really pushing that the buyer needs to be doing their due diligence. All right, as we go on down, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. You guys know how this works. They need to have, of course, the SAP or the RLAS if they are going to be staying. Seller, at close of escrow, section D, seller assigns to buyer any assignable warranty rights for any items included in the sale. So they shall, at the close of escrow, provide the warranty rights. Also, looking farther into section E, you'll see it here. Seller shall, on close of escrow, even if seller remains in possession, provide keys, passwords, codes, and means to operate all locks, mailboxes, security systems, alarms, home automation, intranet, internet-connected devices that were included in the purchase price, garage door openers, and all items included in paragraph 3P. Right? If the property is in a condominium complex, they shall be responsible for securing or providing such items provided by the HOA. Buyer may be required to provide a deposit to the HOA. But here's the thing. Even if seller is remaining in the property, unless otherwise agreed upon, the default is that they are going to give the buyer, at the time of closing, the keys, the mailbox keys, the alarm system passcodes, the ring information, all of that gets conveyed over at the time of closing unless otherwise specified. Right, so if you've got somebody that's staying in and you're representing the seller and they don't want to do that, then you need to clarify that in the counteroffer and addendum later. An addendum attached. So hopefully that makes sense. It's not actually different than what the SIP states now, but a lot of people miss it.
Well, there is one thing, and I will say that I think as listing agents, we need to be very conscientious of, is the passcodes to the cameras. Because there are internal cameras in some properties, especially second properties, that they have passcodes to. So that means the new buyer, whatever it is, the owner, once you're staying in the property, would then have access to certain cameras that you may be kind of concerned about. So just be super mindful on that with cameras, because that wasn't in the last one, right?
It is, but in a different section. It's not specified in the seller, in the SIP and the RLAS. But do yourself a favor, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller. If the property has this home automation that's going to be conveyed over, have them, make sure they understand that they're going to need to give over passwords, to give over all the information at the time of closing. They need to be changing those passwords ahead of time. Not the day that the mover is there and they're trying to get everything and they've forgotten what their password is and the computer's already packed and they can't do a reset and all of that kind of stuff, which we all know can happen. You don't want them to have to be thinking about this right on the day of closing and they're trying to move out. So have a conversation with your buyer or your seller, especially if it's your seller. Maybe have them change the passcode a day or two before, or at least know that they know how to get in and do it that day. Because you don't want, generally, they're not going to want to give over the passcode that they use for this, because 90% of people use that same passcode for everything else. So they may want to change it to some default, easy passcode for the day, and then send that over to the buyer. But you may have a listing agent, you're representing the buyer now, put on that hat, you may have a listing agent that has no idea about all of this stuff. You need to be telling them ahead of time, at the time of probably the time of the verification of property condition during your walkthrough. Remind them we will be expecting that information at closing. Please make sure the sellers have it prepared for us. Right? So if you're representing the buyer, because a lot of times you're going to have agents that don't know. But if you are representing the buyer, you need to make sure that that gets transferred over. Because your poor buyer gets there, and now they are now in possession. It's got a Ring doorbell. Nothing ever got transferred over, and the former seller is looking in on their video cameras. Okay, they decided to get up in the pool and somebody else is looking. So make sure you get those passwords changed and to have conversation. All of this, in fact, Julie and I were just discussing in the break, all of this is really going to require more dialogue with both buyer and a seller on what all of this means. Please be prepared to sit down and talk through it, and then you need to stay on top of it and make sure that you're hitting all of these things, all of these commitments. Right? If you're representing the buyer, it's your job to make sure that the seller is getting that transferred over. Have that conversation with the listing agent. Right? Does that make sense? I know, more fun things, right? All right, contingencies and removal of contingencies. All right, this agreement, unless otherwise specified, is contingent on buyer obtaining loans. Right, we know that. If there is no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, The failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle the buyer to exercise cancellation rights to the loan contingency if buyer is otherwise qualified to for the specified loan. All right, you have to think of these two contingencies, appraisal and loan, as two separate things. I hear all the time, well, we waived appraisal contingency, but that's okay because we'll get on a loan. No, we're not supposed to do that. So the appraisal contingency is the property's ability to obtain financing. The loan contingency is the buyer's ability to obtain financing. Right? So if the property doesn't appraise, you can't just automatically say, well, then we're out, right? If they otherwise can be approved for the loan. Okay, but we do see that frequently, people thinking that they are tied together. They really aren't. And the second section in there, buyer is advised to investigate the insurability of the property as early as possible because this is a requirement for lending. Buyer's ability to obtain insurance is part of buyer's investigation. You cannot go out on loan if they can't get insurance that will satisfy the lender. So you've got to start on the front end with that. Insurance is part of the buyer's investigation, not the loan contingency. We had one this year. How much was it? $80,000 a year for fire insurance on a property?
Oh, 95.
95? Yeah, it was crazy, right? But fire moved forward anyway.
I want that headline.
But do note it is not part of your loan contingency. Buyer's obligations regarding deposit, balance, down payment, closing costs are not contingency of the agreement unless otherwise agreed. Right? They are agreeing. What is the most important part? They are agreeing that they are going to buy the house at the time specified, for the amount specified, and they're going to perform in a timely manner. This one, if buyer does not obtain the loan specified and as a result unable to purchase the property, seller may be entitled to the buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. So you got to be careful too with telling people they can or can't keep their deposit. It will tell you later that the agent and escrow cannot advise on that. But if they are waiving things and then do not close, then they do have the potential for the seller to be entitled to the deposit. All right, appraisal. Unless otherwise specified, it is contingent upon the written appraisal of the property by a licensed appraiser. Appraisals are often a reliable source to verify square footage of the subject property. However, the ability to cancel on measurements falls within, again, the investigation of the property contingency. So let's say you have waived your property investigation, and now the appraisal comes out, and it says that this house is smaller, or the lot size is significantly smaller than what you thought. You cannot go out on appraisal for that. You can only go out on appraisal based on the value, not anything else that comes up from the appraisal. Okay? You can only invoke appraisal contingency if it is a value problem. Yes.
Then why would we continue to use our square footage and lot size disclosure? Because aren't we then putting ourselves in a liability position where the contract seems to eliminate that?
We'll see if Mona agrees with you. So I have not had any information back from her as of yet on what she is going to continue to require as ancillary documents. Good question. Section G, you've got, this is all the same. It does say though at the very end of that paragraph, I think this is where I'm having too many things in my hand. Seller after delivering the form, right? The buyer, if they refuse to enter into necessary written agreement to accept this is not where we're at. Okay. What? Anyways. Okay, sorry, lease of lien items. Right, sorry, these are the items, same thing with the disclosures of the plan unit. If they do not agree to these, this is a contingency, right? You need to make sure that they are signing agreement for HOA documents, they're signing agreement for lease or lien items, so that the seller can send over a notice to perform. Buyer absolutely has to have the opportunity to review those items and then has to agree to them. Okay. Talked about this a little bit before. Removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer. Buyers will have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all the required documents, reports, disclosures, etc. Right? If buyer does remove this contingency without first receiving the information, they are acting against the advice of the agent. Right? We see this again later where it talks about the recourse on that, but you need to let them know that is in here. If they're walking into the transaction or they without contingencies, or if they remove their contingencies without doing their full thorough due diligence, they are acting against the advice of the agent. Any contingency specified within the time period, they will remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. Okay, so they're agreeing to do that. Within the time frames, that is all the same. Sale of buyer's property, that is the same as we have now. You would attach the COP form. Okay, fun stuff here. Remember we had that spot on the grid with the bathroom mirrors and all of that. Now we get into further detail on what is it included in the sale. First thing they want to note though is that the MLS and marketing materials are not contractual. If it says in the MLS or it says in its beautiful marketing materials that something is part of the property or is included in the property, that does not become part of the contract. MLS is not contractual. Marketing materials is not contractual. The only thing that's contractual is the contract, right? So if you want something to be included or excluded, it needs to be here, right? Particularly think of that with your hat on of being a listing agent. If your seller said they want something excluded, just putting it that way on the MLS does not make it contractual. You need to make sure it gets into the contract. Right? So, what is automatically included? All existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. Existing electrical, mechanical, plumbing, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs, all of this great things. Solar power systems, built-in appliances. Here's the fun one. This is new. Appliances for which a special opening or encasement has been included, whether or not checked in 3P. So let's think about that wine fridge. They didn't check the box on 3P for the wine fridge, but the wine fridge is sitting there with cabinetry built around it. Now that needs to convey. Okay, so anything that is, and leave a bottle of wine in it for safety. Okay, so more than one. So any special encasement makes it attached. Okay, windows and door screens, awnings, shutters, yada yada yada. Basically, any material that cover any portion of the window. Doesn't matter what it is, right? Attached floor coverings, antennas, air conditioners, pool equipment. They now have a list of what that includes, including the pool cleaners, the nets, the covers, right? So you're talking about even the little net thing. All of that is included. Garage door openers, of course, there were more patrols, the mailboxes, any in-ground landscaping, water features and fountains. Who has the client that has like little dolphins spraying out water, and that's really important to them? That stays unless otherwise excluded. Oh, again, water softeners, water purifiers. So those ones that are under the sink that they think would not be like a big system. They're connected, they're under sink, that is included. Light bulbs.
Finally, right?
Yeah, light bulbs, including the smart ones, are included, right? This is, remember, we've got that paragraph 3P so that you can use as a reference, and then it does give you this if currently existing at the time of acceptance. So remember I said you're going to run across some lazy agents that just want to check the box for everything. You do have this little out of, well, they checked the box for the wine fridge, but there isn't a wine fridge. Right? It does say if currently existing at the time of acceptance, then we better have a picture that shows that there is no wine fridge. So, just be aware of that. Now, the seller does not intend to include any items specifically because it is not owned by the seller. This is a new thing. Stager comes in and puts up some window balances or a cute little shelf thing in the bathroom. You need to exclude it. So if the stager has brought in stuff that is in any way attached or referenced in here, like covering any portion of a window, you need to make sure you exclude it. That must have been a lawsuit somewhere from some stager, right? All right, security systems, any devices, hardware, control units that monitor and secure the property, including but not limited to all these things, whether they are hardwired or not. If they've got cameras sitting around, right, that are just Wi-Fi enabled, they are still included. They're not hardwired, they're still included. Home automation, including anything like, this would be like your Nest, your rings, the lighting system, anything that is hardwired or not, that is controlled by a smart device is included. There is a lot of that out there, you guys know. So please have a conversation with the seller of what they do and do not want to leave with the property, and be prepared to address that with the potential buyer. Right? You also have to include, oh, again, we've got light bulbs. You also have to include the devices that manage those things unless they're non-dedicated. So sometimes you walk into these properties and they've got like a tablet that hangs on the wall as the control panel. That tablet would stay because it's only being used for that. Obviously, if they're just using their phone to control things, that would be considered a non-dedicated device, and that does not have to stay.
So Google Home is Google Home, you know, that tablet is Google Home. It also
Google
plays
Home would
Spotify
stay,
and all that
yes,
stuff.
all of those things if they are dedicated to the smart home system and are not utilized by the client in a personal manner or for any other purposes. Yeah. You're absolutely excellent. Right. So did you guys hear what she said? If the property is tenant occupied and the tenant added any of this stuff, you need to make sure that that gets excluded because it's not the seller's property to convey, it's the tenant's. So if it's a tenant occupied property, you see any of those things, make sure you have that dialogue and have it excluded. Okay. Good. She gets another article. Okay. All right, these are main items. They have to deliver the written materials regarding the warranties, right? So that all has to be submitted over there. Same thing with these and main items. They represent that items included in the purchase price are being transferred free and clear of any liens. So make sure, particularly if you see solar panels on the roof, that you have checked to make sure, is that wholly owned? Is it leased? Is it liened? Is it on the title? Is it a lien? Is it a hero loan? Like, what is it? How did it get there? Do they have them give you that information up front so that you can get it to the buyer as part of that disclosure process very early? You don't want to wait until you're already in the middle of the transaction to start digging into those types of things. Okay. Another page. page then.
Page 7, the top also addresses.
Items included, you'll see this is pretty small. They pretty much want you to include everything. But we talked about this earlier, brackets attached to the wall, right? Right now, it is brackets stay, we're changing that to brackets go. Brackets go. And they will remove, the holes and damage shall be repaired, but not painted. Find stuff, walk into your new house and have a bunch of white patches all over the walls. Okay, allocation process. Okay, the grid, this is just saying, the grid determines who pays for what. So generally, you're going to be referencing the grid. If it's something that needs to be negotiated outside of that, you're going to use the repair request, the seller's response, an addendum, or an amendment. So those would have to be, anything outside of the grid from an allocation of costs will have to be addressed on another document. Okay, we talked about the legally required installation of, this is going to be your smoke detectors, water heater, bracing. Okay, this has to be done, completed within the time specified on the grid, paid for by the party specified on the grid. If buyers pay for these items, then buyer can give the money to escrow, or they can give the money to the vendor directly. Okay. Prior to close of escrow, seller shall deliver buyer a written statement of compliance in accordance with the law unless the seller is exempt. Okay. The seller is to pay for these items and does not fulfill the seller's obligation in the time specified. Buyer can incur the costs, and seller shall be responsible for the buyer's costs. So if they don't do it, seller's supposed to do it, seller didn't do it, buyer ends up getting somebody to do it, they can require the seller to be responsible for that payment by submitting the vendor invoice to escrow. This item right here where it said, wait, just in a hurry, where it says, the written statement of compliance, right? The written statement of compliance is actually can be utilized the TDS. TDS provides the language for the written statement of compliance. Now, we frequently are giving the TDS sometimes before those things are done. So in a very perfect world, your sellers will have completed these things, signed their TDS, and be able to give that at the time of at the execution of the contract, and we're not dealing with all this later. But that's where the language is for the statement of compliance is referenced. Great. Point of sale inspection reports. This is everything that is going to be required. It is referenced in the grid as to who pays for it.
Really, I have a question.
I always put in my counter offers, and if I represent owner, I put in there that the seller will not be changing plumbing fixtures. Because it says at the point of sale that we all have low-flow toilets and all have low-flow shower heads. And we're all supposed to have that, not just buyer, seller, and landlords. And it's a point of sale. And it's just a general law for the state of California for everybody. So I always put that in there because because most people don't want low-flow shower heads. And my seller's not going to go in there and sell and change them, only have the buyer go back and put it.
Correct. Well, the state only requires the smoke detector, the water heater, and the bracing. I'm sorry, smoke detector, carbon monoxide, and the water heater bracing. Those are the state requirements. Now, the properties are supposed to have the low flows after a certain period of time. That is not actually a point of sale requirement that's being enforced in any way.
It says it.
It is.
In Los Angeles.
In LA City, it is.
At a state level. So cities, each city can have their own point of sale requirements, kind of like Ventura has the sewer lateral inspection under certain conditions. Right, so each area, so definitely within LA City, you've got a lot of additional requirements, and so you you do have to negotiate in here who is going to be responsible for what. And that does get addressed in the grid. If you want to clarify it further, you can put it in the additional conditions or in an addendum. But at the state level, they're only showing the point of sale requirements being the carbon monoxide, the smoke detector, and the water heater freezing. So if, again, this goes to the same thing on point of sale as the legally required installation improvements, depending on who is paying for it, it can be done through escrow or paid to a vendor directly, but the end of the day, prior to the verification of property condition, you need to have the proof of those things be provided to buyer.
Marilyn, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be opposed to this. Carbon monoxide detectors are required, correct?
Yes.
And we use the water conservation plumbing addendum to address the carbon monoxide, because it's in there. That's where we use, we don't have a separate addendum for it, right? So, we also put in that addendum, it says, water conservation, low flow shower heads and low flow shower heads.
It does say that. It does say that. But we do not have local compliance requirements as a point of sale.
1,000 But does it Agora Hills, does Westlake Village and development?
Westlake and Agora Hills do not, LA City. LA City.
Yeah, but we're selling ours.
Does the county?
No.
However, you're not making a bad suggestion, I tell you, in that, although one might worry that you're going against law because it is a civil code. So
I'm just making it the buyer's responsibility.
Yeah, which I don't think is a bad idea. And so it has always bugged me too, because we have to do the water conserving carbon monoxide, but we don't have point of sale compliance requirements in the county of Ventura.
Sharon?
My sales manager, Chuck Lamb, he's taught me, just on the top of that form, just put an asterisk and say buyer to comply. And that way, it's clear on there that you're not disputing it, you're just saying the buyer needs to comply with it.
And where would you put that? Where are you?
On the top of the form, that everybody signed the water conserving form,
okay.
just put an asterisk at the top, buyer to comply.
Okay.
That's what we've been doing.
That's a good idea.
On the actual water concern.
All right, we'll dig into that one a little bit more, maybe in the office meeting. All right, if there are re-inspections required, right, this happens a lot, they didn't get the stuff done in a timely manner, then re-inspection is required. Seller shall be responsible for any corresponding re-inspection fee. Okay, so seller is responsible to cover those costs. You can get that into the escrow company for reimbursement on that if that is what is needed. So, buyers and sellers are advised to seek a knowledgeable source regarding local and state mandates and point of sale requirements. Agents do not have expertise in this area, cannot ascertain requirements or cost of compliance. I think agents generally are, clients would expect agents to have some expertise in that, but we do have this disclaimer here. Okay, home warranty. Buyers shall choose the coverage regardless of any optional coverage indicated in the home warranty plan. Buyer shall pay for the additional money that exceeds the allocated cost in the grid. Right, buyers are informed that there's many different options, but again, buyer can choose the coverage, which is great. You don't have to write that in anymore. They're informed that buyer can waive a home warranty in this grid and then still purchase a home warranty prior to close of escrow. Okay. Okay. Statutory disclosures. fun stuff. All right, seller shall within time specified. Again, this is our grid, which is 7 days. 3 and 1 is 7 days. Deliver to buyer the fully completed notices that are required by the civil code. Which is not, including but not limited to RTPS, our NHD. We've got a slew of things here, including the Melrose, the industrial and military ordinances. All of that is going to be included in your NHD if you're using a good NHD company. And if the property is in a high or very high severity zone in the FHDS. So these have to be provided within 7 days.
Quick question, for the FHDS, our company requires it, so where would we add that? Just for the advisories, or is it both?
It's a disclosure and an advisory, so it would be probably under disclosure, or under addendum. Or sorry, under advisory. I think under advisory.
But that's just based on, because it's not advisory, that is.
Well, it doesn't matter, it's a statutory disclosure that has to be required, so it's already being addressed and it's being provided, so I don't even think, yeah, you don't necessarily have to type it in there.
So like in my current transaction, it says if the property is in a high fire zone, the property is not, the bill rec requires one in.
True.
So then they didn't want to sign it.
Right, so we had this whole discussion with Mona about that, yes, so I would include it.
They don't have
It's
to.
not really
They really
an
don't
addenda,
have
or
to.
they would have to sign it if you add it in there as being a advisory within the, if it's not, okay, here it is, it's advisory, sorry, I had to think through this one. It goes in the advisory section, because if it is not in a high fire severity zone, then it is no longer a disclosure, it becomes an advisory, so it goes in the advisory section. Okay. I knew I could get there.
I agree with that, but if it's in a high fire or very high, I do not think it should fit in as an advisory, because it's not. So you better make sure that it is not in the right, that, what zone it's in before you put it in advisory. I wouldn't do that. I
But
think
the
that's
thing is as a buyer, you may not necessarily know that going in unless you have checked the fire map ahead of time.
That's why I don't think you should put it, I really don't think you should put it in advisory, because if you're not sure, you just gotta be careful with that, because you're
But
saying.
if it's not sure and it is indeed a statutory disclosure, then they are required to provide it anyway.
100%, but you don't wanna be calling it an advisory, if
But then
that's
it
the case.
becomes, well, the difference is, it does still say, the name is still includes the term advisory.
Marilee,
Could we get
you tell us what you're
incorporated into this
Just
offer?
stick it in there somewhere else.
Sign
Sign this, please. Sorry.
It's a good one.
we couldn't understand what you were talking about.
Okay, so,
Sorry.
fire hardening defensible space.
Yeah.
It is a statutory disclosure for a property that is located in a high or very high severity zone. Mona would like us to include it on every transaction, whether it is a requirement or not. And if they're exempt from a TDS, then we've got that as a whole separate thing. But if, generally speaking, as long as they're completing a TDS, they need to include that document. That is Mona's position on it. What Teresa is saying is that where in page 4 do you reference that? Because if it is not in a high or very high severity zone, then it's not considered a statutory disclosure that you would have to include. So to get them to actually sign it, you have to add it into the contract, in which case should it go under addenda or should it go under advisory? It's technically not an addenda. Really, it's a disclosure. If it's not, if it's in a high or very high severity zone, it's a disclosure. If it's not in a high or very high severity zone, it is an advisory. The question then or the comment that Carolyn raised is that if it's in a high or very high severity zone and now you've added it as an advisory, you have negated its ability to be the disclosure. I don't know if that's entirely true. You can have.
I don't think you've negated it, but I just don't think that, I think that if somebody refuses to sign something that they do not have to sign, too bad. Like that, they just say,
If it is in the purchase agreement that they've agreed to sign it, then they have to sign it. We don't put it in the purchase agreement, and we request it, and they don't sign it, then simply put it in the file that we requested it and they didn't sign it, right?
Email.
Yeah, just get some paper trail.
And the high fire severity zone is going to be based on the state map or the NHD?
State
Map
map,
only.
state map.
Only.
Now, state map and NHD should, perfect world, be the same.
They're not.
Sometimes they are not. If they are not, that means one says it is and one says it isn't. You are always going to err, though, on the side of caution on that and go ahead and provide the disclosure. But generally, the CAR form references the CAR fire map, the CAL fire map, not the NHD. So if you're looking at that disclosure document, they are saying you check the fire map. Okay. What does, this says, remember it says a fully complete, right? The fully complete means that every one of those boxes has been checked, right? That it is a fully completed disclosure statement. Not that you have a seller that has decided not to check some of the boxes and send it over.
Yep.
That is not a fully complete. And guess what? If it is not a fully complete, it keeps your time frames open. So if you are the listing agent, make sure that you are getting a fully complete disclosure doc packet. Every checkbox is addressed over to your buyer. If you are representing the buyer and you get something that is incomplete, please send it back and ask the listing agent to do it properly. Now, if you are using a program like, a lot of us like to use Glide. Now we've got access to Breeze, which is the sky slope disclosure process, very similar to Glide. Actually, I think even possibly a little easier to set up. If you're using Breeze, it's not going to let the seller complete it without addressing every single box. That way you know that it's going to be a complete package. It also includes here that you have signed, right? The seller signed, the seller has signed, the seller's agent has completed their visual inspection through the Avid. So those of you who wait until it's about to close to go do your Avid, you have left this open-ended. Don't do that to your seller. Okay? You've got to get it done. It should be delivered within the first 7 days. Get your Avid done early. Okay?
What does that mean, if applicable?
Avid is not a required document, visual inspection is, so on the TDS, they can check the box and just type in their visual inspection information. But we, as a company, are requiring the Avid to be utilized as your visual inspection. Some brokerages do not use that. So it's the visual inspection that's required. Right? Okay. If there's any supplemental disclosures, those have to be provided in the same time frame. So if they're not doing the TDS and they're doing the ESD, that has to be provided in the same time frame as well as the SPQ. So while the SPQ is not a statutory disclosure, right? SPQ is not a statutory disclosure, but it is a contractual requirement because it is here in the RPA being delivered within that same 7-day time frame. Any questions on that? Any of those documents will be considered an amendment to TDS SPQ. Subsequent amendment will not be required for conditions or material inaccuracies which the buyer has otherwise aware or discovered by the buyer's inspections or any inspections provided or paid for by the buyer. So now we've got, let's say, they've provided the TDS, the buyer does some investigation, they find that there's some kind of problem with the property. That does not need to go on an amendment to the TDS. This would only be something that is not discovered by the buyer that the seller now becomes aware of. So, okay, the buyer finds it. the seller doesn't need to update their TDS. I didn't write it. Few of these people on the forums committee, we make it to legislature. Yay! It does pick up speed, I promise. This is the same, no change here. Yay. Home fire hardening disclosure advisory, defensible space disclosure addendum. This is the thing. The home fire hardening is required for any TDS, property with a TDS, and it has to do with the date of the home. Anything built prior to 2010. And again, both of these are, from a legal perspective, are high or very high severity zone. Right? So home fire hardening is required with high or very high severity zone TDS pre-2010. However, defensible space is TDS, high or very high severity zone, any age of the property, right? Which makes sense because the defensible space is do you have a bunch of, flammable stuff up against the property. Doesn't matter how old the property is. Fire hardening has to do with the construction of the home. So those are the two, and this is a statutory disclosure. You cannot waive any of these statutory disclosures. Would be against the disclosure. All right, signed copies shall be delivered within the time frame specified, which is the 17 days that they have for their investigation period. Okay, any of these are delivered to the buyer after signed, and this is where we do have a little bit of a question on the consistency in the messaging on this. So, any of these disclosures, so A, B, C, D, you're looking at your TDS, your NHD, your lead-based paint, your fire hardening, are delivered to buyer after the offer is signed. Buyer shall have the right within 3 days for personal delivery or 5 days after delivery by giving written notice. Seller, if buyer does not rescind the business time period, buyer has need to have approved the disclosures and shall not have the right to cancel. If those disclosures are provided prior to purchase agreement, that cancellation right is not in effect at all. Right. So be very mindful of when you are receiving these disclosures and review them in timely fashion. Reminder on the defensible space. This has to have mutual agreement on who is going to be responsible for the compliance, and that is done through the fire hardening defensible space disclosure. Okay. All right, here we have a section that is the same as what we've got now. So withholding taxes, this is a reminder though, this is the same, but it is a reminder that escrow will withhold, and they will do that withholding unless they receive the seller's affidavit of non-foreign status, right? So this contract, which is the same as it is now, it requires, it's the responsibility on the buyer to receive that information, to be responsible for those withholdings. So either the buyer has to, the seller has to provide the seller's affidavit directly to the buyer, but most of the time the sellers do not, but that includes their social security number, so most of the time the sellers do not want to provide that to the buyer. So it's going to go through escrow, and escrow is going to give you a qualified substitute. disclosure. So just make sure that that is happening there. We are seeing a few escrow companies locally that will not act as qualified substitute. And so that affidavit of non-foreign status needs to go from seller to buyer directly. So be aware, you want to make sure whichever escrow company you're using, fortunately Inter Valley is absolutely fine to act as qualified substitute, but you want to make sure that you are, really want to look at having a escrow company that is going to do that so that you're not having to facilitate those social security numbers coming through. If they send it over with that redacted, it is not considered a complete document. Right, this isn't new, but it is a reminder, because we are starting to see more escrow companies that decide they don't want to take on that liability. Okay. Megan's law database, that's the same. Gas and transmission pipelines, that's the same. This HOA condominium disclosure, that's the same. Just a reminder of the time frames, which have not changed, right? The seller's got to order them in 3 days. They need to get to the buyer. Buyer has their time frames to review. This is all the same language that we already have. Natural hazard, and environmental hazards. The seller shall provide those guides, right? Most of the NHD companies include those links. If they don't, those documents are also available in the ePubs library. You can send them that way. We do not need to be passing around those books that the NHD companies used to pass out. Okay. Just do the links, save the trees, makes it easier for everybody. Reminder, whether they are exempt from these disclosures or not, the sellers do have to disclose any known material fact. You guys know how that is the case now. Okay, let's do, how are we doing? Okay, we're going to do buyer's investigation, and then we'll take another break, and we'll be able to wrap it up. Okay, you guys hanging here for one more section? Doing great. All right. Okay. Not doing great, doing great. All right, buyer's investigation of the property and matters affecting the property. So we have had a tendency to say our physical inspections, right? And we need to start using the phrase investigation of the property, because it is more than just our physical inspections. It is being broken down now into what they're calling a three-pronged right. Okay, a three-pronged right to investigate the property. So the first prong, one here, is the inspection regarding the physical attributes of the property and items connected to the property. This is going to be your home inspection, any other type of inspections if you're getting HVAC, sewer, whatever you're doing. So lead-based paint is of course itemized in there because that is part of our statutory disclosure, but they always want to make sure that that comes forward. You have the right to test for that. Inspection regarding wood destroying pests, that is your termite inspection, of course. And any other inspections that regarding the physical condition of the property. Right, that's that. That's prong number one. Prong number two is all other investigations. All right, this is things like the insurance that we talked about, right? You can't go out alone for insurance because you go out, if it's insurance, you've got to go out on investigation of the property. Same thing for the size, right? The neighborhood, any other things related to the property that you want to research. And then the third one is the review of reports and disclosures and information provided by the seller. So those are your three prongs of investigation of the property. The contingency removal form is being updated to allow you to remove contingencies based on each of those three prongs individually or collectively. However, the notice to perform is not going to allow them to be individually released. Notice to perform is going to request all of your investigations released at once. But in your contingency removal, you can select of the three. Any questions about how that works in the 3 different categories?
No, I like
Okay, we have somebody that likes something, yay! Okay, buyers shall neither make or possibly make any invasive investigations, except for the minimally invasive testing to prepare a pest control report. Yes, sure, we've all seen the guy that goes like this every 6 inches, but he gets a pass. Also, inspections by any government building or zoning must be, you must have the seller's written consent. Guess what? That includes the defensible space. So if you want to have the fire department do a defensible space inspection, the seller has to consent to that. Okay? Okay, seller shall make the property available to buyers for investigations, but they're not obligated to move any existing personal property. So good luck on the houses that have the hoarders. They don't have to move anything. Seller shall have the gas, water, pilot lights on for the investigation through the date of possession delivered to buyer. Where do we see, why is pilot light on here? Where do we see this? They turn off the gas to have the property tinted for termites. They go to turn the gas back on, and now it's red tagged and pilot lights are going to be on and all of that thing. If this is the seller's responsibility to have this on and functioning through the time of possession.
Mary,
Uh-huh.
can that be, under other terms, that upon completion of inspection, seller has the right?
You can counter it out.
You can?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can counter it out.
All right.
Buyer, okay, this obligation shall survive the transition agreement. Okay? So that means, right, it's already closed to escrow. Okay, we're all done. No, this requirement is survives the termination of this agreement. So if they have closed escrow, we've all moved on, doesn't matter, they need to make sure they get that pilot light on. Okay, buyer shall keep the property free from any liens, repair all damage arising from buyer's investigation, right? We've seen that where the home inspector comes out and now there's a hole in the ceiling because it's footprint through in the attic, right? This is buyer's responsibility. And indemnify wholesaler harmless of all resulting liability claims, blah, blah. Buyer shall carry, or buyer shall require anyone acting on buyer's behalf to carry, right? Policies for liabilities, workers' comp, and other applicable insurance defending the seller from liability, blah, blah, blah. So now you need to talk to your home inspector and make sure that they've got the appropriate coverage, because otherwise buyer is signing that they are going to be responsible for carrying that insurance coverage. Yeah, I'm sure there's some insurance agents out there contacting every home inspector in town. But they are agreeing to that here.
Oh, this is interesting.
Okay, again, the buyer's investigation work done on the property, buyer's obligations under the paragraph shall provide information of the agreement. So even if they cancel the agreement, we still have a hole in the ceiling, right? The home inspector put a hole in the ceiling. Now the buyers decided they don't like the house they're canceling. Buyer is still responsible for that damage. Okay, some good news. Title investing is the same. Just a reminder, they have 7 days. Buyer has 7 days to give escrow holder necessary information to their title. That is the same as it is now, but just a reminder. And then do this paragraph, and then we'll take a quick break. If the buyer is a legal entity, right? Not a person, but an entity, purchasing the property for at least $300,000 with basically made without a loan, without a bank loan. So it's cash for more than $300,000, and it's an entity. They are agreeing to provide the information necessary for the geographic targeting order issued by federal crimes enforcement. So basically, they are agreeing to cooperate with the title company on the source of those funds, right? So if you have anybody that's, you know, a little wiggy on things, just make sure that, just know that that's in there. You don't want something crazy happening with that transaction. Yeah.
No, I was just, whenever you see a Freeland come over and have bright red Freeland on your stop, it's generally saying.
Oh, okay, on the Freeland?
Yeah.
Okay. Bright red letters on a Freeland?
Title request.
The title is requesting that information. Okay, and buyer, upon closing, of course, will be receiving a grant deed. This is just saying, manner taking title will have legal and tax consequences. They should consult a professional. Nothing really new there. Just capitalize the letter. All right, top of the deed. This is the fact that they are going to be getting a title policy ending the year. If you have any questions about title and what the ALTA or CLTA is all about, then you can go talk to Jen. All right, let's look at time frame. So paragraph 14, section 14. Guess what? What have we always referenced? Look at section 14, right? 14B, 14B, 14B. We've used that as a reference point for many, many years. They at least maintain that the information regarding the time periods and removal cancellations for the inspections and such is still in 14B. They're still in 14, so at least you've got that going for you. All right. So the time frames are what has been usually agreed upon. All right, anything beyond that would need to be addressed in an addendum, and we're going to be using the contingency removal for removing any contingencies in regards to these things. So seller has to deliver the time frames. This is paragraph 3 and 1. That is your 7 days. We've seen that repeatedly through here. So again, they have to provide all of this stuff, all these different paragraphs, that's seller responsibility in 7 days. The buyer has the time specified in paragraph 3 to do all of their investigations. Okay, that is their 17 days. Okay, that is nothing new. In section 2, just a reminder that the seller has no obligation to agree to anything in a repair request. Right, we know that already, but they don't have to agree or even respond. So just a reminder on that one. If buyer is not contractually entitled to have any repairs made and only can cancel based on the contingencies of this agreement. So if we don't come to an agreement on repairs, the buyer's option is to cancel. They can accept the property in its condition or they can cancel. That's their option. Okay. Buyer shall deliver to the seller at the end of that time frame the applicable contingency, removal, or cancel the agreement. That's what they've got as their option. Okay, so down here, find it on here. Okay, so the buyer has 5 days after delivery. So 11A and 11B, these were our statutory disclosures. Right, they have to deliver the seller removal of the contingencies based on that. Delivery of any report occurring after a contractual contingency pertaining to that report has already been waived or removed. Delivery of report does not revive the contingency. Okay, it does not revive the contingency. So now there is a little potential option here. But there may be a right to terminate for a subsequent or amended disclosure under paragraph 11G. What is 11G? That goes back to the statutory disclosures. Okay, so there's a little wiggle room on statutory disclosures, but generally speaking, if they have released a contingency and something new comes up, it does not revive the contingency, period. Okay? Some people look like they're questioning the situation. Even after the timeline specified and before seller cancels, Buyer retains the right to remove contingencies or cancel this agreement on any remaining contingencies. Once buyer has removed all contingencies, seller may not cancel this agreement. Okay, so once the buyer's performed, buyer's removed their contingencies, seller's not canceling. So when can the seller cancel? Section C, seller can cancel if buyer doesn't remove their contingencies in the time frame agreed. Okay. Seller can cancel if buyer is not meeting their contractual obligations. So there's a variety of things in there, right? They have to do their earnest money deposit, they have to provide their escrow documents back to escrow, all of these things that they have contractually agreed to but that aren't necessarily contingencies, right? They can cancel on that if they're not meeting those contractual obligations. Or a seller can cancel if seller has a contingency that, that they have not been able to waive. So if it's seller's home of choice and they did not find their home of choice and they're within their contractual time frame for that contingency, seller can cancel based on that.
Does this contract call for a time for the seller to respond to the buyer's request?
No.
Again.
So does the contract require a time frame for the seller to respond to a buyer's request? That was the question?
Yes.
No. In fact, specifically states they don't have to respond. They don't have to respond. There's no time frame on that. You get to the end of your investigation period, and if the seller has not responded to anything, buyer has the choice to remove contingency or cancel.
So it looks like that because they're doing the verification of funds up front, that's part of the seller ability to cancel it now.
If you're doing the verification of the funds, yeah,
Up front.
yeah, it's done upfront.
That's it.
Or if you check the box and you're verifying the funds 3 days after, it would have to be within the contractual time frame provided, so they don't have 3 days
Yeah.
to get that in.
So in the timeline section, the notice for buyer to perform is not on that. So,
Right, we're about to get there.
okay, so it's a separate section. Got it.
Separate section, looks a little bit different, not too much, but a little bit. Okay, buyer's right, so that was seller's right to cancel. Not a lot of opportunity there, right? I mean, if the buyer's performing, there's not opportunity there. If the buyer's not performing on cancellation of, or waiving their contingencies, releasing contingencies, or on their contractual obligation, of course, seller's going to have to do the notice to perform to be able to enact their cancellation. Okay, so in all of these, if the seller is going to cancel, the seller authorizes the return of the buyer's deposit. Right, that is automatic in here. If the seller enacts the cancellation, the seller is allowing the release of the deposit. It's on each one of those paragraphs. Buyer's right to cancel. Buyers, of course, have opportunity here with their contingency. So if the seller has a contingency that's not obligated, that's not met, then they can cancel on that. Seller's contract obligations or any of the buyer's contingencies. So buyer's got a variety of contingencies in here. They can cancel on any of those, for any of those reasons. And again, if that were to happen, then fees incurred, then it will enact the return of the buyer's deposit. We tend to make a lot of claims that a buyer's deposit will get to go to the seller. You know, well, they didn't meet their obligation, they waived their contingencies, now they're not performing, you know, whatever it is. Please be careful suggesting that any of that money is automatically going to go anywhere as well, because of course we know that any type of cancellation is going to require the mutual signature, and mutual signatures for the release of the deposit, right? So we have seen even recently somebody just outright refusing to sign on those cancellations and holding up deposit money. So we have traditionally been, just thinking that that earnest money deposit goes in there, but don't worry, it's not really tied up. It really is because both parties have to sign for that to ever be escrow. Or it is a report. Okay, so that was buyer's rights to cancel.
What section of the as is Clark in?
As is,
You see it? Oh my God. It's not. Keeps falling and going. It says that you have to go to MVP.
okay.
Wait, I didn't see that.
Notice
Where
is
are
the
you?
buyer is selling to
NS.
Okay, we have current RPA is that 2 days or checkbox, you can adjust those timeframes. No longer the case, it is hard set at 2 days. While we're here, demand to close is hard set at 3 days. So you don't adjust those timeframes in the RPA any further. If you want to adjust them, you have to do it on an amendment or a counter offer. That's where you would have to do it, but they are hard for the team to here on those dates. Oh, is this the page that I'm going back?
Yeah, it's actually me.
Sorry, you guys, did you guys find it? Where is it? Between 4 and 5? We haven't printed it. There's so many five already. All right. Okay, it looks pretty though. Didn't marketing do a beautiful job on this booklet, you guys?
That's interesting. What's that?
Okay, so just a reminder, okay, this time frame, you cannot send the notice to perform any more than 2 days before that action is due. Right, so you can't send it earlier, right? You have to send it within no sooner than the time frame that was already agreed upon. Right, so if you had a contingency release that was supposed to be today, you could have sent it on Monday, that's Tuesday, Wednesday, that's 2 days for notice to perform, but you could not have sent it on Friday or over the weekend. If you try and issue a notice to perform that is outside of the contractual timelines, then that one becomes null, and you will have to have a new one. You will have to issue a new one. So don't try and issue it early, thinking that you're, getting ahead of the game here. It doesn't just then extend out. That notice to perform is invalid, and you have to do a new one. Does that make sense? Okay, same thing with the demand to close. Just you're kind of connecting, so like have them together. Okay. All right. Exit cancellation on deposit. Again, they're going to have written notice, right? And all the parties have to agree. And the release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from the parties or a judicial decision or arbitration award. A party may be subject to a civil penalty of $1,000 for refusal to sign cancellation if no good faith dispute exists. This isn't here, this is in the RPA now. This is civil code, but we don't see it too often. Of course, you're gonna have to end up in court to pursue that as well. $1,000 isn't really much to have a stick to hit people with, but it is in here if you've got somebody that's really being difficult about not wanting to sign. If there is not a good faith reason, then you can remind them that they may be subject to a $1,000 fine. Neither agent nor escrow holder are qualified to provide an opinion on whether a party is acting in good faith and which party is entitled to the funds. They are advised to seek advice from a real estate attorney. Please don't try to give them your professional advice on that. You need to be careful. I do hear a lot of people that suggest that, well, you'll be able to get their deposit. Not always the case. Frequently not the case. Okay. All right. Repairs shall be completed prior to final verification of condition, unless otherwise agreed. Oh, remember this, otherwise agreed. Remember I talked very early about the capital letters? Otherwise agreed is a term, and it does mean in writing, mutually signed in writing. That's what otherwise agreed when it is capitalized is referencing here. Okay, repairs are to be performed at the seller's expense and it can be performed by the seller or others within the applicable permits, inspections, such they will be performed in a good and skillful manner, quality and appearance comparable, but buyer acknowledges that the restoration may not be exactly possible. Okay. Seller shall obtain the invoices and receipts, give them to the buyer, prepare a written statement of any repairs that the seller personally performed, and provide copies of invoices and paid receipts prior to final verification of condition. This is all in our current RPA, but I want to point it out because as an agent, you have written a repair request that has been approved and you come up time to the final verification. Don't wait for the final day or day before close of escrow to go over there and check it out. Highly encourage you to be in on the front end of that 5-day window and remind the listing agent that they are to provide those receipts, invoices, and statement at the time of the BP. There are a lot of people, the sellers tend to think that it's at close of escrow. It's not, it needs to be done 5 days before. So if you're representing the seller, make sure that they understand.
I would also like to point out that it is very important. It does say in the line above, sellers provided that work complies with applicable law, including government permits. If something if you've agreed for repair and it is something that requires a permit, you are on the hook for that permit.
Yes, absolutely. And you'd be surprised at how many things are supposed to require a permit. And I highly recommend that you get contractors, write it in your, if you're representing the buyer, write it into your repair request. They're going to have a licensed contractor, unless it's something really small and easy. You're going to have a licensed contractor perform the work that is going to give you the best protection for your buyer. Just be aware, make sure that you are asking for those receipts and information well in advance. Okay, final verification of condition. Same, they have 5 days. Remember, walkthrough is not a contingency of the sale, right? They may have other breach of contract opportunities, but it is not a contingency. They cannot hold up closing back.
What about that as-is clause?
What about that as-is clause? Yes, but it absolutely is not a contingency, so that they, according to CAR, is if it is not in the condition that it is supposed to be in, you are supposed to continue to close, and then it becomes a breach of contract issue.
Wait, say that again?
It is a breach of contract, not a contingency. So it's not a contingency that you can hang on to not close or to cancel the agreement.
The house burns down. Well, to give it a dramatic thing, seriously. I mean, it does happen. So the house burns down, you have to close.
I think that's pushing it.
No, that's not.
Sorry, well, it depends on the situation, right? If the house burns down, I mean, you can see during the wildfires that lending gets halted, that closings get halted. That is, I mean, these acts of God are a little bit different, but a buyer not completing an agreed upon repair request item is not a contingency. They didn't water the yard, pool cleaning, that's different than the house burns down. Proration of taxes and other items, that is the same as we have now. Okay. All right, compensation. When do we put compensation in the contract? Never. Never, never, never. Okay, compensation is never addressed in the purchase agreement, the counter offer. The agents are not parties to this document, right? Compensation is going to be separate.
Yeah, my daughter just got
Separate
hit
agreement.
with a $40,000.
Not a situation where you're adjusting compensation, you're going to use it as a form for that, does not go on the contract in any way. Right, you know about that? Okay, this is a nice long scope of duty of what we will, or mostly what we will not be responsible for, pretty much not pretty much anything, you can read this. But, it's basically putting all the onus mostly on buyers to their investigation, so we are not attorneys, we are not going to verify certain footage, we are not going to verify cares are done by a qualified person. We're not supposed to be doing any of those things. We do a lot of that anyway, but that is in here in the scope of duty. Right, this talks about the role of escrow. So see all these paragraphs? These are all the things that escrow is responsible for. So it's just basically going through the entire escrow responsibility in here. Nothing that is new. So just move along from that. Do you want to know that buyer and seller will receive the general provision? They have to do their return paperwork in the time frame that's agreed upon in the grid. So they're going to have 5 days from the original opening package, 3 days for subsequent escrow documents. Okay? They need to make sure that they're getting that back in a timely manner. Okay, copy of this counteroffer also, and the counteroffer is supposed to get to escrow within 3 days. Please don't take that long, just like Doug saying he wants to see those contracts as soon as it gets executed. You want to get it over to escrow as soon as it gets executed as well. Okay, again, agent is not party to the escrow, is a minimum compensation. But again, compensation does not go on this contract. Buyer and seller acknowledge escrow may invoice for expenses under the agreement. So remember where it said things like, if the appraiser has to come back out and do a re-inspection fee, they've already acknowledged that they are going to be charged for that, right? And this escrow company is going to use this contract as the seller's agreement to cover those expenses for buyer's outreach negotiation. Agents do not guarantee the performance of any vendors, right? Multiple listing service. Right, this one. Basically says the buyer acknowledges that any photos, videos, floor plans collectively referred to as these, or any information about the property that's into MLS, internet portals, or both, at the instruction of the seller or the client's MLS rules will not be removed after close of escrow. Civil code requires MLS to maintain those images for at least 3 years. That may be displayed or circulated on the internet, cannot be controlled or removed by the seller or by agents. The seller's agents or agent MLS has no obligation or ability to remove such images. All right, how many times we close escrow and the buyer wants that stuff off the internet because they think it is a security concern? I don't disagree, it's a security concern. Doesn't matter, they're agreeing here. It's
What
not going
page
away.
are you on?
12. Sorry? 12. 21. Page 12, section 21.
So is this saying that we cannot ask the listing agent to remove the picture?
Correct.
Okay.
And the seller, also in the residential listing agreement, is acknowledging something similar, that once that is input into the MLS, that it's not coming back off.
I've had it several times.
They want it off. I know they do, they want it off. But it's not coming off. Why? I don't actually know why, everything's in MLS. But once it gets out on the internet, it is so incredibly impossibly hard to pull it back in. So we can't hang that on the MLS to try and figure out how to bring it back. Once it's out, it's out. Now it's out of the bag. Okay, attorney fees, of course, will go to the prevailing
Wow, okay.
party. Assignment, remember I talked about assignment way back at the beginning of the class, right? Assignment, the buyer has the right to request an assignment, meaning they wrote the contract, now for whatever reason, they want either another person or another entity to take on the purchase transaction. So they have the right to assign it to their own trust or any wholly owned entity, right? They don't even have to ask for that, they can just do it. Wholly owned entity, right, or their trust. Otherwise, they will not assign it without having first obtained written consent from the seller to a specific assignee, right? Specific. So that's where I said, remember we said at the beginning, I still occasionally will see residential purchase agreements that will say such and such buyer or assignee. No, you don't put that in there. You have the right for assignment. You do still have to ask, and it needs to be the specific person because they are going to make sure that that specific person or entity is providing the pre-qualification, right? They are going to sign all of the disclosures. They are going to provide all of the proof of funds and the verification of funds and lender letter and all of that will need to come. All of the obligations that the original buyer had needs to be provided to the seller from the new assignee. Right?
So what if you want to assign to somebody else, not to the buyer?
So the buyer can choose to have it assigned, can choose to request for the seller to allow it to be assigned to somebody else. They have to request.
I put an assignee and I cancel this one, 23. I just say it's not part of this contract. That's how I do it.
Okay, I guess you can,
Yep.
right? Anything is negotiable.
Yep.
Except for statutory exclusion.
Apparently,
What?
I have 3 people this year wanting to be the signee, and all my sellers said no.
Right.
So what we did was, I didn't know, I asked Bruce Ladd, God love him. He made out a statement, and we put in the counter offer. And it was a great statement, and it shook up a little bit for the buyers to say, maybe I don't want to do this. Gave them the right to under a lot of conditions. And so it's really good.
Yeah, and this is actually a much expanded assignment. So it is putting meeting requirements on the buyer if they want to have an assignment that they would need to have this potential assignee go through all of the same requirements that they went through. Okay, the buyer shall provide all of these documents. Okay, whether or not assignment requires seller's consent, right? It does not require consent if it's going to a wholly owned entity or the buyer's trust, right? And they also do not have to sign, if it's a wholly owned entity or the buyer's trust, they do not have to re-sign.
So is that an LLC, correct?
An LLC,
Okay.
if it's wholly owned, but a lot of times you see those LLCs or corporations are not wholly owned. Sometimes they
I
are.
can't wrap my head around this for some reason. Okay, so I wrote an offer under my client's name. In the middle of the contract, he decided he wanted to create an LLC for this branch.
Okay.
So in the middle of it, he created an LLC, and then when we closed, it was an LLC.
And it's wholly owned, it's not an LLC with multiple partners.
Right. Okay, so that is,
Except, under this contract.
okay.
Under this contract, yeah.
So I think there needs to be clarification on this because in court supervised, the court order stands. So they don't have the ability at any time during the contract period
To do the
to assign.
Right,
Because
so
the
you
court-
could counter that out.
So
on
that's
any
gonna
of
have
your
to be
notice
taken
or-
out.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
absolutely. So, where were we? Does not need to re-sign the documents. Again, if it is trust or
We're gonna
wholly
cross it
owned.
off and have them
Otherwise,
initial.
they do. They do have to re-sign everything.
That's gonna be, because I'm not gonna have a separate line. So I'm gonna have
this-
this crossed out and have them
Such
initial.
consent, right, the seller, such consent is not to be unreasonably withheld. So if the buyer wants to assign it to someone that is equally capable of performing on the contract, and they have provided all of the documentation, the seller's refusal to cooperate, okay, this should not be unreasonably withheld. And it is within a time frame too, right? Our current RPA has assignment very open-ended in time. It does not have all of these requirements in it. So if you want to, maybe it's a cash transaction, it's going to be a shorter escrow period, and you're concerned about that, you could also shorten the time frame. Right now, the standard is 17 days. They have to submit that request for an assignment within 17 days. Seller cannot unreasonably withhold consent to do that. But any total or partial assignment shall not relieve the buyer of their obligations unless otherwise agreed in capital letters by the seller. Okay, so buyer is still, first buyer, still fully on the hook for everything. Yep. No, so the form to use is the AOAA. The AOAA is the form to use to request the assignment. That's not new. We've had this. But again, it has put in some more parameters, which is a good thing.
This may be a question maybe for Carolyn, like off the record, but how she was saying the sellers rejected or didn't want to sign the assignment. Why would a seller?
Yeah, I mean, why was the seller not wanting to participate in
Well, these
assignment?
were all pretty high-end houses.
Why
And
what?
the people were very concerned about their neighbors. They wanted to make sure that everybody was.
Well, let's talk about.
They want to make sure that if it was to be an assignment, it would be to a trust or an LLC like you said.
Right.
They didn't necessarily want it to be a person that had no,
Interest?
not interest, but had no contact with the actual buyer. They wanted to make sure it was somebody that the buyer knew.
Sometimes there was a history,
Okay.
I'll answer it in a general way. There was a history before of straw buyers.
Right.
And straw
Yes,
buyers.
that's what the neighbor concerned, yes.
Yeah, so a straw buyer is somebody that uses somebody else to come in and then they get the property that they know they've got the property they keep.
Maybe I
Exactly, that's what all.
But you gotta be really careful with that because of the.
He's in Vegas.
Right.
Right, and the straw buyers is exactly the reason why they added assignment as an option in here, but because prior to assignment being in the RPA was when we started, when we were writing John Smith or assignee. That was the assignment that they were using, that was the language they were using when it was the straw buyers, because it was leaving it open-ended to who the assignee could be. Right, they have to stop using that language because it has to be the specific assignee. The seller has to agree to the specific assignee.
That's exactly.
But I think Stacy did bring up a good point that Bruce does have very good language for that assignment restriction that complies with equal housing.
To protect the seller or the buyer?
Well, from assignment, you're protecting the seller, right? You don't want the seller to say, I refuse
Why does he
to
keep talking?
take this assignee because of who they are. You know, you've got to be very careful with fair housing.
We're not gonna have.
All right, so again, equal housing compliance, all of our fair housing, just a reminder, and of course we have the addendum that is going to be attached to that. Here we get to definitions, you're almost at the end, super close to the end. Okay, definitions, acceptance, right, acceptance has changed just a little bit. All right, means the time of offer or the final counter offer is fully executed in writing and the recipient party has delivered to the authorized agent. Guess what? Confirmation is gone.
Oh.
No more confirmation, no more we need the signatures or we need an email confirming receipt, none of that. So that is problematic on one side or inconvenient on another, but that is where acceptance meets.
No more.
Okay, we're going to talk about delivery in just a second.
So that means,
Agent, within this contract, the term agent is anyone associated with the brokerage broker.
So the
right?
counter offers,
Although
that's gonna be
authorized
removed from
agent,
there?
which is what we see more frequently in the contract, is the specific license identified in the broker section at the back. All right, so just be aware of that. We are, we are 13. We jumped over to 13. Not on page 16 yet. Close, so close, so close. It's really fast.
Probate
Okay,
claim jurisdiction. Okay, so it's all of them.
All right, the as is, you know what as is and what an as is condition, and the actual definition is here. Close of escrow, including COE, is the date that it is, that we have evidence of transfer of title. Counting days. So there's always a lot of question about counting days. Days, again, is our capital D in here. You use the calendar days for counting the days, but remember, no performance action on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. No performance action on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So if your contingency removal date falls on a Saturday, you actually cannot request that performance until Monday. If it falls on a Saturday before Labor Day, you're not going to be able to get that until Tuesday. Okay, and then so remember about your notice to perform, what is your action date would be until that Tuesday. You back it out 2 days from then, not 2 days on your calendar date. So if you have any trouble counting days, I know. Lisa helps a lot with counting days.
Don't include weekends or holidays.
Feel free if you're a little, like, who's done this in a particular situation, have you sit down, let's get out the calendar. But this gives a much better description of days than the previous RPA. So you should be able to follow along if you read it. And remember that counting days, it doesn't matter what time of day it is. So if you get the executed contract at 6 a.m., today is still day 0. But if you get it at midnight, today was still day 0 and tomorrow is day 1. Doesn't matter what time you get it. Sorry, midnight's not right. It would be 11:45. Today was still 0 and tomorrow is day 1. Right, as far as the SIP, right, the occupancy date, I think we mentioned this earlier. COE is day 0. You start counting after that. Okay, let's talk about delivery. Delivery this is a biggie. This is a really big change with this contract. So we are not dealing with confirmation. Acceptance is based on delivery. So what does delivery mean? That the documents have been effective upon the person receiving of documents by the buyer or seller, their authorized agent, by means of document or applicable link to the document is in the possession of the party or authorized agent, regardless of the delivery method, or an electronic copy has been sent. Has been sent. Does not say has been received. Has been sent. Okay, that is you're going to see in a few pages here where you're going to put the email address that is the delivery address. And it better be an email that you check on a very regular basis. Because now the execution, it is based on somebody sending it to you, and they say they have sent it to you. If you didn't get it, you didn't open, you can't open the link, whatever it is, that's on you, not them. So that is a huge change in this contract. Right, and it is even specified that it can be a link to the document. Right, now there is down here, you send in writing within 3 days. If you didn't get it, you need to reopen this time frame. This is going to get to be really messy. I feel like this is just going to get really messy for a lot of people. So just be aware what email address you're putting on this form. Make sure you are reading your email, responding. If it's something that you need to open, make sure you can open it. You need to go get a new smartphone. We can do all of these things. Go do that now, right? Because the time frames start clicking, and that's on you, not your client. It's on you to be able to open it up. Okay. Electronic copy, video is fully available. Again,
Yeah, so if you're sending the document, you might want to do a test email the day before, so they say, yes, I got it. Because if you send it and you don't look to see that it bounced, if you type something wrong, it didn't get set to the right email.
Yes.
So that would be on you, wouldn't it? If it gets bounced?
If they can prove that it bounced, if it can prove that it bounced, I would say you want to have dialogue with the listing agent, like have dialogue with your operating agent, and just make sure you got it, they've got it.
Yeah.
You know, that is really how we're going to get through this, is having that dialogue. The documents can even be sent as a link via text, right? It can even be sent that way, that is acceptable. So make sure you have a device that can accommodate this, and that you have it with you. Legally authorized signer, we're going to see that in a second. You hear a lot about, right now we use the term representative capacity. So we're not going to be really using representative capacity so much anymore. The new terminology is the legally authorized signer. So we're going to see that paragraph in just a second. Okay, this is all your standard language, same terms and conditions of the offer, right? The whole thing is the terms and conditions, time is of the essence. That this is all standard, so it's similar to what we have now. All right, 28 though. 28 at the bottom of page 13. The legally authorized signer. This is what we think of now as representative capacity. This person shall be deemed a representative capacity entity and not individual capacity unless otherwise indicated. The legally authorized signer represents that they are in good standing to do business in California and such. So they will provide evidence of their ability to be a legally authorized signer within 3 days. That's in our grid. That's the 3-day time frame. They have to give you that information. It could be such as a portion of the trust cert, court power of attorney, business entity documents, etc. So our legally authorized signers are what we are calling that now as opposed to representative capacity. All right, so good news here. We get through this next page, really quick, page 14. Yay! Liquidated damages is the same as it has been. No change here. Mediation is the same. You are automatically agreeing to mediation. That is not an option. Whereas arbitration, which is the same arbitration language, both liquidated damages and arbitration have to be signed, initialed by both parties to be applicable in this contract. Mediation, however, does not. Right? Mediation is a given, which is the same. All of this is the same. Right? You guys are all good with that, right? Yeah, everyone's like, yes, move on, please. All right. Nikki, we're almost at the very end. All right, expiration of offer. This is right at the end of the contract. Remember that time frame is now the third line of the grid. So reference E3C for that. Seller has no obligation to respond to an offer made. Right, there is a place here where they can initial that they are rejecting an offer, where they can initial that it was presented, but a seller has no obligation to respond to an offer made. All right, entity buyers, again, we're talking about that representative capacity. You don't need to use the representative capacity signature disclosure anymore because that's now built in, baked in, which is nice, one less page to have. So entity buyer, you would check the box, and then you're going to include the full name of the entity, and this is our signature line for the entire contract. So signature line is signed, print, and it is a legally authorized signer. You're going to check the box, have them sign, and add their title. So remember way early at the very, very beginning, we talked about if it is trust with a crazy long name, you can use an abbreviated version of that. In here is where you would need to put the full and complete name. And that is perfectly acceptable to use the abbreviated version throughout the contract as long as you have the full and complete name here. And of course, you're going to have this authorized signature and title. So this is the buyer signature portion. If we scroll up a little more, we've got the same thing for the seller. So acceptance, you do have two checkboxes here, the counter offer or the backup addendum. So we've always had the counter offer checkbox. We've not seen the backup offer addendum checkbox in this section, so that has been added. You will note it does not have the line item for the number or the date that we have in our current RPA. So it's just counter offers, right? This is counter offer. We're back up. Seller, entity seller, same exact thing as the entity buyer. We're going to put the whole complete name here, signature line. So just remember, these signature blocks are used if it is an entity buyer or an entity seller or not. If it's a regular buyer or seller, these are still the same signature blocks. You would just not be needing to check the boxes that it's an entity. Does that make sense?
So
Easy.
the full complete name needs to be under these here.
Right.
But the signatures could be the abbreviated one?
No, at the beginning of the contract, when it's this is an offer from blah, blah, blah buyer, that can be a abbreviated version. So if they want to buy it in the form of a trust, but their trust is the John, blah, 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 the Mary, blah, 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 dated, blah, 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 right? You don't need to put in all that, you just put the John and Mary family trust. And then in here, we're going to put in the full and complete signature, or full and complete name.
Says you have to
Right, and then of
give.
course you're gonna have their signature, they are going to sign just their name. They just sign their name.
They don't have to sign Joe Smith trustee?
No, because we've got the title indicated here.
Following is the
And this
full name
is
of the trust.
identifying them, their personal name and signature as authorized, legally authorized to sign.
Which they'll be supported by the
The
backup
document that
documents.
needs to come into place within 3
Put the
days.
name of the trust.
Yes. Okay, if offer is not accepted, seller can initial there.
Right.
Real estate broker section, all right, at the very end, you guys, remember I talked about, please think about which email address you're going to put in here and make sure that it's something you're checking. And also stay in communication with that cooperating broker if you're expecting anything and you don't receive it.
The question on that is as the selling, as the listing agent, and they have provided you with both an email and a text number, are you obligated to send them to both?
No.
Well, also on this email and alternate, you're not required to send it to the alternate?
No.
Okay.
No. You provide an alternate, they always send it to the alternate, is that correct?
Only to check it.
It's checked, they're running it on the alternate. It's checked. Okay, seller brokers, same thing, so both agents need to complete this portion. So be thoughtful of that, right? You are the listing agent, you've received it, now you put it into DocuSign for signatures. You're going to have to put this, you're going to use text box and DocuSign to add that in for yourself. Okay. Okay, again, same thing as seller, escrow holder has their spot for acknowledgement, and then we've got the same box that we have now as presentation offer. Guess what? We are done.
Yeah.
Good job.